The untold account of Jesus, the one they attempted to suppress, still haunts the hidden corners of the Vatican, a secret locked away within sealed vaults, forbidden documents, and a quiet that spans centuries. Deep under layers of stone passages and copied ancient records lies a truth the Church has never fully denied. This truth suggests Jesus may have journeyed not just across Galilee, but far into the high plateaus of old Ethiopia. These are not comforting tales shared from pulpits, but murmurs passed around in the soft glow of monasteries and dismissed behind official closures. Tonight, we trace this forgotten route and question the motive behind the Vatican's choice to hide it. So please settle in, close your eyes, and allow the narrative to unfold. If you enjoy uncovering suppressed facts beneath the long silence of history, please think about subscribing. There are many other secrets waiting beneath the golden ceilings of the Vatican. It all starts not with a proclamation, but with quiet. Not the peaceable kind of quiet, but the heavy kind that presses against the ancient stone walls of the corridors. For hundreds of years, devoted travellers have kneeled in the shade of St. Peter's Basilica, their devotions rising like smoke toward the gold dome. They arrive looking for solace, clarity, or pardon, but few ever dare to ask the one question. No one risks speaking it out loud. Where exactly was Jesus between the ages of 12 and 30? The accepted Gospels mention his birth, his early visit to the temple, and then nothing more. Almost 20 years simply vanish from the official history, as if the record itself decided to skip ahead. But deep inside the Vatican's oldest storage rooms, far beyond the secure gates of its private archives, rests a brittle scroll. It is not titled, not logged, simply folded tightly within a worn leather covering. It was found completely by chance in the early 1950s, according to a former Vatican staff member who later vanished under unexplained circumstances. The man was not an academic. He was not a clergyman. He merely cleaned, swept the marble floors, lit the oil lamps, and dusted the areas few ever entered. He claimed the manuscript was wedged behind a cracked shelf in a room hardly ever used. It was written in Latin, but the final line, in faded, crimson ink, stated, "His journey led south, where the great beasts drink and the celestial lights do not sleep." Initially, the note was ignored, assumed to be a lyrical doodle, a monk's forgotten thought. But something about it persisted, something the Vatican decided not to completely forget. The Church has always maintained the firm doctrine that Jesus stayed in Galilee until his ministry began. But not all the first Christian groups agreed with this. In fact, scattered throughout the ancient Ethiopian highlands, there are stories of a visitor who arrived long before Christianity was ever formally preached there. A man with smooth olive skin, kind eyes, and words that felt like warm sunlight on fresh water. They referred to him as the teacher without sacred texts. In the mountain monastery of Debri Damo, one of the most ancient Christian sites in all of Africa, monks still share the account, not in books, but through song, slow, resonating hymns sung just before dawn. One hymn, performed very rarely, speaks of an unknown person who came during a severe drought. He communicated in simple lessons. He performed healing with a quiet presence. And when the rains finally returned, he disappeared, leaving only subtle marks in the dust. No one in Rome officially recognizes this oral tradition. But in 1972, a Vatican map maker produced a modified religious map, one that included a very faint red line drawn from Bethlehem, across the Red Sea, and deep into Axum. A week later, his access privileges were revoked. The map was never produced. Some suggest the truth was too distant from established beliefs. Others speculate it was too close, threatening to dismantle everything. And so the silence continued. But a profound question still hangs in the shadows of the archive. If Jesus genuinely walked the Ethiopian plateaus, why did the Vatican choose to hide the story? And who else was aware? The explanation perhaps starts with a single stroke of ink, not within a holy volume or a hidden scripture, but in the border of a map. It was sketched by a man named Pietro della Rosa, a reserved, systematic cartographer who worked for the Vatican during the early part of the 20th century. He was not known for causing controversy. He did not preach or challenge official doctrine. His only strength was accuracy. And yet one simple red line in the corner of his map would become a difficulty too big to disregard. Pietro had been assigned the task of updating the Vatican's sacred geography collection, a series of maps kept only for internal usage. These maps were more than just geographical, they were spiritual. They indicated where saints had travelled, where holy visions had been recorded, where churches were built directly atop older pagan sites. The work demanded extended days beneath oil lamps, copying from much older scrolls, translating faded inscriptions and verifying notes that had not been touched for centuries. One afternoon in the winter of 1936, Pietro discovered something unusual inside a rolled-up manuscript near the bottom of a locked drawer. It was a portion of an older sacred map, Roman in style, labelled in Latin but showing an unfamiliar route, highlighted in delicate red ink. The path started near the Sea of Galilee, moved south through Egypt, crossed the Red Sea and concluded far inside the Ethiopian highlands, not far from the ancient capital of Aksum. Along the trajectory, 3 small words were faintly written in the margin, almost invisible. Viator Domini transit hic. The Lord's traveller passed here. Pietro was puzzled. He searched for the specific reference in official records, but found absolutely nothing. No corresponding notes, no known origin. It was as if the map had been intentionally removed from memory, surviving only in this single forgotten copy. He made a quiet decision. On his newly updated map he had the red line again, perfectly matching the original. He did not emphasise it. He did not mention it in his required report. It was simply present. A week later, his superiors requested a private discussion. What exactly transpired inside that room is still a matter of debate. Some claim he was formally warned. Others say he was compelled to take an oath of secrecy. But the one certainty is this. The updated map was never officially printed, and Pietro never returned to work in the archives again. He was moved to a quiet position in Florence, never spoke of the Vatican again, and passed away in 1954 with no known relatives. But among his personal effects, tucked inside a folded piece of linen, was a hand-drawn duplicate of that same path and a solitary note beneath it. He travelled much farther than they ever admitted to us. The Vatican has never made a statement about the situation. The drawer holding the original manuscript was later sealed off, but the path was drawn once, and once was sufficient, because someone understood and someone wanted it permanently gone. Long before Pietro della Rosa ever encountered the red line traced through Ethiopia, another person had written something even more revealing. It was not a map, but a personal letter, and it was never intended to be found. It was discovered in 1979 during a routine reorganization of Vatican storage areas beneath the Apostolic Library. A small iron lockbox was located behind a pile of unused shelving, its exterior covered in dust, the key still jammed into the lock. The staff assigned to inventory the contents were young and completely unfamiliar with the gravity of what they were handling. One of them, a quiet clerical archivist named Lucien Varela, opened the box as a matter of procedure. He expected bills, schedules, perhaps a few minor notes on lesser-known saints. What he found was a single folded letter on high-quality parchment, completely protected from the air for decades. It bore no date, no author's signature, but it was addressed in elegant Latin handwriting to His Holiness, the Patriarch of Ethiopia. The wording was lyrical, highly formal, yet chillingly precise. The letter thanked the Patriarch for his ongoing silence regarding the matter of the early teacher, and acknowledged the mutual agreement of how such information might destabilize the unity of the entire Church. It also referenced something else, something far more disturbing. It mentioned the lost record of the pilgrimage, a phrase never before seen in any official Vatican document. It warned about the severe dangers if the story were to reach unprepared minds. And it concluded with a sentence that made Lucian's hands turn cold. Let the memory of his journey remain precisely where it was first walked, and let no voice raise what the heavens have decided to bury. Lucien did not show it to his superior right away, not initially. He took it home with him, concealed beneath his coat. That evening he made a single typed duplicate and returned the original before morning. He never mentioned it again publicly. But years later, after he died, the copy was found inside a private journal left open on his desk, and next to the printed text was a handwritten line in shaky blue ink. I believe he went. I believe they all knew. No one has managed to confirm the letter's exact origin. There is no signature, no official stamp, but the ink has been scientifically verified and corresponds with other documents from the early 20th century. Who wrote it remains a mystery. Why it was never sent remains completely unsaid. But somewhere between Rome and Ethiopia, between the quiet of the vaults and the living memory of the highlands, the truth continued to wait. A letter that was never delivered, a map that was never printed, a path slowly being erased from the official record, but never from the heart's memory. A shadow in the archives. It was a young researcher named Emilia Donati who came across it. This happened in the summer of 1996. She had been given a straightforward assignment, reviewing old mission reports from the Jesuit expansions into the continent of Africa. Most of the files were simple inventories of supplies, records of local illness, letters from missionaries complaining about weather and crop failure. But when she found a folder marked Et Apuka, she paused. The label was illogical. It was not a known area, it was not a saint, and it was not part of the archive's standard classification system. She took the folder to a supervisor, a tall, silent priest with grey hair and a pronounced limp. He looked at the label, and his composure shifted immediately. He gently took the file from her hands and placed it into a nearby empty drawer without any explanation. Then, in a low voice, he stated, "Some paths are simply not ours to follow." Later that week, Emilia returned to that particular area of the archive completely alone. The drawer was gone. Or, rather, it appeared to be. The entire tall shelving unit had been smoothly moved away. In its place was a bare stone wall and a quiet electric fan humming above. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something small near the floor. A light dusting of dirt and a tiny corner of paper visible from the gap between the wall and the marble tile. It was not an entire document. It was a torn piece of a note, 2 lines of Latin, no signature. When translated, it read, "Do not bring light to the corridor. The name is only written in the dark." She kept the small paper scrap. Years later, long after she had left her position at the Vatican, she attempted to locate the archive again. She returned as a regular visitor, claiming to be researching her family's history. She walked the passages, carefully retraced her steps, but the specific hallway was missing, or perhaps it was just concealed once more. Only a small group of people ever knew about that sealed wing. Those who spoke of it did so in broken sentences and with world-weary eyes. One of them, an elderly Belgian historian, once commented at an academic conference, "There are certain rooms in that complex where the atmosphere feels more ancient than the stone itself." And in one of those rooms, someone wrote something they absolutely should not have. A sealed flask that disappeared. A hallway that technically does not exist. A shadow that shifts, but leaves no trace. The deeper one ventures into the Vatican's core, the more the natural light seems to fade, because what remains hidden there was intended to stay hidden for good. But nothing intentionally buried stays quiet, indefinitely. Secrets accumulate weight, and over time, that crushing weight presses down upon the souls of those chosen to protect them. One such person was a man whose name has been almost entirely forgotten, except for a single note left behind inside a confession booth no one had used for decades. His name was Father Adriano Marcelli. He was not a learned scholar, not a bishop, not even an ambitious man. He served the Vatican quietly for more than 40 years, working as a simple custodian within the private sections of the Apostolic Archive. His duties were to clean the reading rooms, deliver the approved scrolls, keep the dust off the shelves, and most importantly, say nothing at all. And he never did. Not a single word, not even when directly questioned. But something shifted dramatically in the winter of 1973. That year, Father Adriano started going to confession much more frequently than was normal, always to the very same small booth, always completely alone, always late at night, long after the basilica had been fully secured. The priest on the other side reported that most of the time Adriano said absolutely nothing. He would simply kneel down, breathe slowly, and whisper one single phrase, "I have seen it." No one ever knew what he truly meant. Then one particular night, he failed to appear, and the next morning, the priest discovered something very unusual tucked directly beneath the kneeler. Sealed inside a small envelope was a handwritten letter, not addressed to any specific person, simply folded neatly with a Vatican wax seal across the back. The letter contained 6 simple lines. There is a room with no given name. There is a document with no identified author. The writing is older than the entire church, and it speaks of a path our faith cannot permit. I was given the task to guard it. I have successfully done so, but I worry I am no longer strong enough to maintain its absolute silence. Father Adriano was never seen again. Some claim he was merely reassigned somewhere else. Others believe he died soon after, although no obituary was ever published and no grave was ever marked with his name. His small apartment was emptied within a few days. His personal items were boxed and sealed. When questioned, the Vatican provided only one response. Father Marcelli's service has officially concluded, but those who knew him well remembered something distinct. They spoke of a man who carried a deep sadness like a constant shadow, who walked slowly through the quiet halls as if constantly listening for something hidden behind the walls. And once, in his final year, a visiting student dared to ask him if the archive held the real truth about Jesus' early unknown years. Father Adriano looked directly at her and replied, "We are forbidden to use that specific word here. Truth. We are only authorized to protect what is still left." A humble man, a sealed letter, a silence too heavy for one person to hold forever. And somewhere deep within the archive, what he carefully guarded still remains, shrouded in darkness, completely untouched by the passing of time, waiting for either the wrong hands or the right question to be finally asked. And in the high country of ancient Ethiopia, there are people who firmly believe the correct question was answered centuries ago. Not by a formal pope or a learned academic, but by local farmers, monks and shepherds. Simple people who had no massive cathedrals, no elaborate polished robes, no Latin hymns. But they had their stories, and some of those ancient stories speak of a complete stranger who arrived from the north long before any European missionaries ever reached them. A man who was said to have healed without even touching and taught profound lessons, without using any scrolls. Among the Cushites, whose lands once stretched from the Nile River all the way to the Red Sea, there are persistent echoes of a figure they refer to as the Light Walker. He is never directly named as Jesus, but the detailed descriptions are too eerily similar to simply be dismissed. He came during a brutal famine, they recount, when all the rivers ran completely dry and the crops withered to dust. He wore simple white clothing, walked barefoot, and slept only beneath the stars. He spoke of deep compassion without any trace of pride and inner strength without anger, and wherever he travelled, the life-giving rain followed closely behind. It was an Italian missionary in the late 19th century who first meticulously recorded these strange local tales. Father Matteo Lorenzi, stationed at a small chapel near the city of Gondar, wrote extensively in his private journal that the local elders spoke constantly of a holy man who came from the sea, walked entirely alone, and vanished before the first churches were even built. At first, he naturally assumed they were speaking of one of their own local saints. But, as he paid closer attention, certain details began to deeply trouble him. The man carried no weapons. He only ate bread and honey. He carried no staff, but he was always followed by various wild animals, who never once harmed him. One young child, barely 10 years old, swore she saw him gently place his hand upon a dying goat and miraculously bring it back to its feet. Another claimed he made the river rise with just a single word, though no one heard what he spoke. Father Lorenzi carefully wrote down absolutely everything. But when he sent his detailed letters to Rome, they were immediately returned unopened, specifically marked as not for theological review. His superior strongly cautioned him not to entertain local heathen legends. Still, he continued his writing. His final desperate letter, dated March of 1891, contains one single line underlined 3 times for emphasis. They knew him long before we ever did. No official trace of Father Lorenzi remains in the Vatican's official missionary records. It is as if he was never actually there. But his journal, thankfully preserved by the exact same community he served, still rests today in a quiet monastery library overlooking the vast valley. In its concluding pages, there is a simple, rough drawing. A man seated beneath a large tree, his arms raised upward, wild animals gathered peacefully around him, and above, written in careful, clear script, the one who walks with the Sunday. The Vatican has never once responded to any questions regarding the journal, but those few who have seen it say the clear resemblance is completely impossible to ignore. And if he was truly known among the ancient Cushites, then the Church has intentionally buried much more than just a journey. They may have purposefully buried an entire fundamental chapter of Christian faith. And some people spoke in a language so extraordinarily ancient, even the mighty Vatican could not silence their stories completely. Ge'ez is one of the oldest written languages still actively used in Christian liturgy today throughout Ethiopia. It carries the immense weight of countless centuries. A sacred language spoken in reverent, hushed tones during prayer and sung in slow, melodic, rising chants that powerfully echo across stone churches literally carved straight into the mountain rock. For the vast majority of the modern world, Ge'ez remains a total mystery. But for those specialized scholars who have meticulously studied it closely, it holds much more than just religious beauty. It holds something far older, something deeply hidden. In the late 1960s, a dedicated Jesuit linguist named Father Henri Lemoine travelled to the region specifically to help carefully preserve rapidly deteriorating ancient manuscripts written in Ge'ez. He genuinely believed he was merely assisting in a simple translation effort. Yet what he ultimately uncovered led him directly to a private, immediate audience with the Vatican in less than 1 year. Among the many fragile texts brought to him was a unique group of writings known locally as the Parables of the Traveller. These distinct stories were not included in the standard Ethiopian Bible. They were not even marked by official church seals. They were originally shared purely orally for countless generations before finally being written down by unknown scribes, most likely monks, centuries earlier. And within these moving parables, Father Lemoine discovered a powerful voice. The speaker never once identified himself, but he spoke clearly of walking entirely alone through fields ravaged by severe drought. He spoke of healing a young blind girl by gently touching only her shadow. He described a beautiful garden where absolutely no seed had been planted, yet flowers magically bloomed everywhere. His words were notably calm, incredibly gentle, and completely filled with lessons not focused on strict laws or commandments, but rather on profound compassion, deep inner silence, and absolute truth. One compelling parable told of a man who openly asked the teacher, "Why do you walk without any sandals?" And the teacher calmly replied, "Because the earth fully remembers every single step, and I do not wish to accidentally erase the footsteps of the ones before me." Father Lemoyne grew extremely uneasy. These particular stories almost perfectly mirrored the unique voice and gentle tone of the canonical Gospels, yet they came from a remote place utterly untouched by European Christianity. How could an ancient culture that had no access to the four established Gospels produce such essential teachings, so incredibly close in spiritual meaning and exact phrasing? He promptly submitted his detailed translations to the Vatican for official review. Weeks passed, then months dragged on. When the official response finally came, it was extremely brief. He was bluntly told to stop his work immediately and return home. No specific reason was ever given, no explanation was ever offered. Years later, he would tell a very close friend, those parables truly sounded exactly like Jesus. But it was definitely not the Jesus Rome wanted the world to remember. The original scrolls were quickly returned to the remote monastery where they remain today, fiercely guarded by monks who now rarely speak of them to outsiders, but they still sing the sacred words on holy days in Ge'ez, beneath the soft candlelight, and the church once again remained absolutely quiet. Because sometimes the most truly dangerous gospel is not the one that was tragically lost, but the one that was intentionally never meant to be discovered. There is a recurring legend passed down carefully through the highlands of Tigray, one not formally written in precious scrolls or permanently carved in stone, but vividly remembered in secretive whispers by very old monks and solemnly told to young children when the long nights fall. It speaks of a mysterious man who appeared suddenly during a time of intense warfare and famine. He arrived completely alone, carrying no material possessions whatsoever, and he stayed for only 3 short days. Yet, in that incredibly brief time, he left behind a profound story that still haunts the entire region to this day. They call him simply the one who walked through fire. It began in a small village nearly consumed by a devastating drought. Crops had entirely failed. All the wells were bone dry, and the desperate people were preparing to completely abandon their ancestral land. On the second night of solemn fasting, as they gathered outside to fervently pray for rain, the village temple inexplicably caught fire. No one knew exactly how the sudden blaze started. The fierce flames rose rapidly, devouring the dry wood, and thick smoke blackened the thatched roof. There were no water buckets available, no nearby water sources. Only silence and the terrifying crackling sound of burning support beams. Then suddenly, someone spotted him. A total stranger, walking calmly and deliberately through the intense smoke, completely barefoot, his simple robes utterly untouched by the ash. He did not run, he did not speak a single word. He walked straight into the temple through the main entrance, passed directly beneath the burning rafters, and emerged mere minutes later, gently carrying the one single sacred relic the village possessed, a beautifully carved wooden cross carefully wrapped in cloth. When the fire finally subsided, the astonished crowd searched frantically for him, but he was completely gone. No footprints, no discernible scent. Just the wooden cross placed neatly on the ground right beside the only tree that had not burned at all. Years later, a monk from a nearby monastery would write a brief account of this very same man in a small, leather-bound journal. The monk claimed to have personally encountered him in the very early hours of dawn, seated quietly near the mountainside, softly humming a melody the monk did not at all recognise. When politely asked who he was, the man replied, "Only, I remember Eden." The monk respectfully offered him a piece of bread. The man smiled warmly, blessed it, and said, "We will surely eat again when the fire finally ends." Then he completely disappeared into the thick morning mist. That journal eventually made its way to Addis Ababa in the early 1900s, where it was immediately translated and formally catalogued by a French scholar. The Vatican promptly sent a formal request to review the important document, but it was firmly denied by the local archbishop, who strongly believed the sacred writings were far too holy to ever leave the country. Months later, the scholar who had originally handled the journal reported a sudden break-in at his private home. Absolutely nothing was stolen. Only one particular item had been touched: the specific drawer where he kept his personal copy of the translation. It had been forcibly opened. The copy was completely gone. The original journal still safely remains in a hidden archive beneath the National Library. Access is heavily restricted, and the official reason is never explained. But the enduring legend of the firewalker persists because no one ever truly forgets the mysterious man who walked directly through massive flames without a single burn and left behind a pervasive silence far deeper than any smoke. That heavy silence did not just echo through the rolling hills of Ethiopia. It eventually found its inevitable way to Rome, where men cloaked in red robes and adorned with gold rings gathered secretly behind locked doors to solemnly decide which select stories deserved to be publicly remembered, and which were considered far too dangerous to ever speak of aloud. In the spring of 1948, a confidential memo circulated within the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. This paper was strictly private and not intended for outside eyes. It was brief, drafted in Latin, and stamped with an instruction simply reading non proferatur, meaning to dismiss the matter without further investigation. The related file was titled Testimonium Axum, a growing compilation of accounts and field reports from missionaries and independent experts concerning a possible historical link between Jesus and the ancient kingdom of Axum. The documents included ethnographic notes, translated ancient sayings, and even photographs of very old scrolls marked with symbols that predated recognized Christian texts. But a specific report stood out and dramatically changed the mood of the room. It had been written by a Jesuit priest who dedicated 6 years to his mission in Ethiopia. His final submission detailed a small community of secluded monks who claimed guardianship over a concealed manuscript, a text handed down by word of mouth for countless generations before it was ever transcribed. The document, according to his report, portrayed a young travelling healer from the north who taught using stories, not scripture, and who returned alone to the highlands when the setting sun turned a violent red. That final observation was marked with 2 underlines in the Jesuit's manuscript. It was undeniably moving, yet it suggested something more profound. The clear impression of a man not just travelling, but being observed. A cardinal reviewing the official file scrawled one concise remark in the margin. This risks suggesting precedence. Precedence. That was the term that truly unnerved them. If it were ever authenticated, or even widely believed, that Jesus had taught and travelled in Ethiopia before he ever gathered his first apostles in Galilee, it would mean that the foundation of the church had not been built at the source of his teachings, but far away from it. Rome would not represent the origin, it would only be the distant echo. The file was quickly sealed within days. The Jesuit priest who submitted the disturbing report was quietly reassigned to a remote mission post deep in Brazil. He never again set foot in Africa. When later questioned why he abandoned his incredible discoveries, he simply replied, "Some truths are simply too burdensome to carry without help." The Testimonium Axum file remains listed in the vast Vatican archive, yet its contents are entirely absent from the public catalogue. Only its ominous title is visible, and next to it a single word that stops all further inquiry: classificato, sealed. And once a document is sealed in Rome, the resultant silence becomes unbreakable law, not because the entire story was entirely fictitious, but because it came too close to a reality the Church could not afford to acknowledge. Long before the missing journal pages, long before Father Bendetti's eventual disappearance, and even before the Vatican issued its hush commands. There was an ancient trail pressed into the earth that no papal decree could ever wipe clean. It was a route missing from all modern cartography, winding from the shores of the Sea of Galilee down to the highlands of Ethiopia, tracing rivers, arid deserts, and deep silence. Some still called it the Southern Way, and those who remember its existence say the journey culminates where the Blue Nile's waters begin. In the very early 1920s, a young Ethiopian ascetic named Abba Tesfaye embarked on what he sincerely believed was a purely spiritual quest. He had been visited in a vivid dream, or what he called a true waking vision, by a man radiating light who told him, "Follow the water. Truth flows where the river remembers." The following dawn, without breathing a word to anyone, Tesfaye collected his simple sandals, a rough walking stick, and a small leather-bound prayer book. He departed from his monastery and began walking toward the east. For nearly 3 solid months, he followed the winding river through thickets and dry gullies, over cracked stones and across muddy flats. Villagers he met along the way offered him vital food and shade, telling him that they too had recently seen the Man of Light. In their own dreams, they never spoke his proper name, only whispered, "He passed here long ago." When Tesfaye finally reached the riverhead of the Blue Nile close to Lake Tana, he simply halted. He made no effort to continue south. He refused to turn back toward home. Instead, he built a rough stone shelter and lived there in complete solitude for 40 years, repeatedly inscribing only one single sentence in various iterations. He came not to claim a throne, but to follow a river. His entire life's writings were gathered after his death in 1961. A Jesuit envoy tasked with officially reviewing his body of work dismissed the writings as mere mystic ramblings. Yet tucked among Tesfaye's accumulated notes was a list of cryptic phrases written in both Ge'ez and Aramaic, the language Jesus would have actually spoken. No one could ever plausibly explain how a monk who had seemingly never left Ethiopia could write with such fluency in a language he had never been taught. Years later, that list was discreetly examined by a Vatican linguist. Her private, unpublished notes contained a baffling observation. One of the phrases translated as, "He taught the river how to listen." Another strange line read, "When he crossed the water, bent like a bow." No historian or scholar could definitively verify these incredible assertions, but the powerful Blue Nile remains, relentlessly cutting through the high country as it has for millennia, and along its ancient banks small stone crosses have occasionally been discovered, purposefully buried in remote locations where no official churches were ever constructed. No one alive knows who carved them, but they all consistently point north, as if someone long ago truly walked that very path, as if someone was being deliberately followed. But sometimes merely knowing is not enough to truly convince. Sometimes there must be something tangible, something permanently carved, something left behind, a distinctive mark too stubborn for the passage of time to erase. That is precisely what Father Luca Bernini believed the moment he first saw the cross. It was the dry season of 1957, and Father Bernini had been dispatched by the Vatican to the famous rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, Ethiopia. These astonishingly ancient sanctuaries were carved straight down into the red volcanic stone of the highlands, exhibiting no visible seams, no mortar, and no architectural explanation. Pilgrims still arrive barefoot, singing devotional prayers with worn voices and earnest, hopeful eyes. Father Bernini's stated purpose there was the study of architecture, but he had a secret, secondary motivation. A quiet instruction from Rome to investigate persistent local rumours of non-traditional Christian symbols appearing in carvings deep beneath the churches. What he actually discovered was not inside a sanctuary. It was in a damp cavern directly below one. The entrance was low and very narrow, perfectly concealed behind a crumbling ancient stairway. the local officiating priest, an elderly man with pale silver eyes and a voice like dry sandpaper, led him down without uttering a single word. They descended together, relying on the faint light of a lantern, the stone walls perpetually moist with age. At the very bottom, in a small chamber large enough for just 2 men to kneel, a cross had been carved into the sandstone wall. But this was clearly no conventional cross. Its arms were oddly uneven, its base flared out like a sudden flame, and in its centre, instead of the body of Christ, was a sun etched in faint, shallow circles, appearing to glow from within the stone. Encircling it, in the Ethiopic Ge'ez script, were 6 potent words. He came before the church knew him. Father Bernini was stunned to silence. His formal training commanded him to simply dismiss it, to categorize it as folk art, local interpretation, or spiritual metaphor. But his deepest instincts argued otherwise. The lines were remarkably precise, the symbols entirely intentional. This was not merely the product of imagination. This was a clear memory intentionally chiseled into hard stone. He asked the elderly local priest who had created the carving. The old man responded softly. It was not carved, it was revealed. When Bernini returned to Rome, he immediately filed his comprehensive report. He included a detailed sketch of the non-traditional cross and a careful translation of the unsettling inscription. But the Vatican's official response was immediate and final. He was thanked for his service, promptly reassigned to a small parish in southern Italy, and informed that the matter required no further investigation whatsoever. Yet years later, in his final public address before his retirement, Father Bernini spoke words that lingered powerfully with everyone who heard them. He spoke not of established doctrine or rigid dogma, but of a long journey, a journey that reached far beyond what official scripture permitted. He said the truth is not always written within the pages of books. Sometimes it is permanently written in stone, placed there by hands we have long forgotten, for a man the entire world could not successfully contain. And beneath the dense red stone of Lalibela, that cryptic cross remains carved, not intended to be easily seen, but waiting to be truly found. And the essential path that may have led to that permanent carving began much farther north, not in the continent of Africa itself, but in a quiet village known intimately by every Christian person on earth. It is remarkably easy to forget that ancient roads once seamlessly tied the known world together, that before the creation of modern political borders and unforgiving steel fences, people travelled fluidly, with the rhythm of the seasons, carried by trade winds and caravans. The specific route from Bethlehem to Axum was not a fantasy. It was a tangible, real path, worn deep into the soil by countless merchants, travelling priests and nomads, for many, many generations. And critically, this route was fully open and active during the very specific years when the official scripture falls utterly silent about the life of Jesus. Scholars rarely reference this in church sermons, but the long-established routes connecting Judea and the Horn of Africa were extremely well known. Frankincense, gleaming gold, carved ivory, and essential salt travelled south through the massive Arabian Peninsula, across the Red Sea, and into Axum, the powerful beating heart of an African empire with deep power and massive temples long before the European continent even knew its name. But the continuous trade was not only for physical goods. It was a commerce of ideas, of language, of profound stories, and sometimes of people. In the early 1970s, a French archaeologist named Mouret Caron unearthed various fragments of pottery and distinct early Christian symbols along a forgotten dusty trail near the Red Sea's southern coast. Among the religious symbols was one that completely baffled her. A recognizable fish symbol marked not with the expected Greek letters, but with what appeared to be very early Aramaic, the precise language Jesus would have actually spoken. The characters were crude, almost the work of a child, but one short phrase was clear: he walked. No further explanation was provided, no context. Just those 2 simple words. Later, while meticulously reviewing ancient trade records from the Roman Empire, Karen noticed a significant and unusual detail, a peculiar gap in the extensive Roman surveillance logs between the precise years Jesus would have been in his early 20s. These were the very same absent years that no gospel covers, no Roman historian ever mentions, and no church record even touches upon. That stark absence was not irrefutable proof, but it was certainly not nothing. The Vatican quickly dismissed her entire theory as merely an imaginative projection, but Karen had witnessed enough physical evidence. She wrote in her own field diary, "If this man travelled, he did not go west. He headed south to a place where scrolls do not easily reach, and where the human voice carries compelling stories rather than strict verses." To this day, historians cannot definitively say what happened to that specific pivotal trade trail. It simply faded away as massive empires rose and fell over time, but the essential stones remain, scattered across the endless desert like ancient breadcrumbs that time has simply forgotten. And somewhere along those forgotten roads, perhaps one particular figure walked alongside the merchants, not accompanied by guards, not with a growing legion of followers, just a solitary man and his simple sandals, learning from the people the rest of the world overlooked, not preaching the law but quietly listening, because the fundamental truth of any great journey is not always measured in precise miles. Sometimes it is permanently carved in the silence that exists between places that were once connected, and sometimes the most important path is the one the Church strategically never mapped. Far beyond the official edge of those forgotten roads, in a quiet, isolated village nestled between the old lands of Axum and the rising green hills of Tigray, an elder once recounted a powerful story that made even the youngest child listen in total silence. It was not intended to be a parable, nor a religious teaching. It was a memory intensely passed down through bloodlines, of a man born beneath a strange, bright star who had the power to heal with just his eyes and who mysteriously vanished without a traditional burial. They referred to him as the Crowned Son. According to the oral tale, he arrived during the final desperate days of a long, brutal drought. His clothing was remarkably simple, his skin noticeably darker than the villagers had anticipated, and his gentle voice carried the distinct rhythm of someone who had travelled an incredibly long way. He spoke of a true kingdom without walls, of a spiritual power without actual swords, and of a lasting peace that was not forcefully won, but freely given. He made no claim to be a recognised prophet. He claimed absolutely nothing about himself. Yet those who encountered him could never possibly forget his overwhelming presence. One farmer swore his own oxen followed the man through the fields without ever being pulled. Another swore the man cured his sick child's fever simply by humming a melody no one could identify. But the story takes an immediate darker turn. A jealous local noble, enraged by the attention the enigmatic stranger received, commanded him to immediately depart. When he quietly refused, soldiers were dispatched to forcibly drag him from the village. Yet when the armed men finally arrived, he was already gone. All that remained was a worn linen robe folded neatly beside a lone fig tree and a cryptic message written in the dust. "I go where I am needed, not where I am crowned." Years later, a travelling monk passing through the area heard the captivating legend and asked an old woman specifically about the stranger. She took the monk to a hidden grotto concealed behind a roaring waterfall and showed him a faint stone carving, barely visible but still there. It showed a man with no physical crown, yet above his head floated a distinct bright star. Surrounding him, various animals bowed low, and beneath them, the words, "The son who wore no crown but bore the name of kings." The monk copied the faint image and brought it back to his distant monastery, where it was stored among local folklore. Decades later, the strange image caught the keen attention of a Vatican scholar who was visiting the region on assignment. He instantly recognized the unique symbolism, not only the star, but the careful layout of the figures. It strangely mirrored early Christian iconography that had been discovered in Roman catacombs, but the faces were clearly different, the features unmistakably African. When asked for his professional opinion on the carving, the scholar only replied, "It tells a story we are simply not ready to believe." To this very day, that crucial carving remains untouched, hidden behind the steady, cleansing fall of water and clinging moss. The local villagers do not actually worship it. They do not even speak of it very often. But when young children ask where the powerful man went, the answer is always precisely the same. He left before they could place a crown on him, because he was never meant to wear one. In the ancient historic city of Axum, where towering stone obelisks stretch toward the bright sky and time itself feels permanently carved into the very earth, there is a small chapel that is excluded from most modern maps. Its rough walls are faded from rain and the smoke of countless incense offerings, and its simple doors are guarded more by deep silence than by physical locks. Standing inside is a statue known only to those who live nearby, the Black Madonna of Axum. At first glance, it closely resembles the numerous Marian statues seen throughout the Christian world. The Virgin Mother gently cradling her holy child, a posture both familiar and deeply sacred. But something here is profoundly different, something the Vatican has never openly acknowledged in its official records. She's carved from a dense, dark stone, her facial features distinctly African, and her eyes are deep and all-knowing, as if she's not just looking at you, but actively remembering you. In 1964, an Italian anthropologist named Paolo Moretti visited the area specifically to study Ethiopia's unique religious art. He was finally permitted to enter the chapel after many weeks of frustrating negotiation. What he ultimately discovered left him deeply shaken. The statue was not only physically older than the simple chapel itself, local tradition emphatically claimed it was carved long before Christianity had officially arrived in Ethiopia. Moretti noticed a detailed inscription at the base of the statue, worn down by time, but still perfectly legible. Translated from Ge'ez, it read, "She held the child before the world knew his name." This single sentence would fundamentally challenge everything he thought he understood about history. How could a Marian image plausibly exist before the known documented spread of Christianity? And why did it surface here, in a place so far from Rome, so far from Bethlehem, so far from the exact path the Gospels meticulously described? He returned to Rome with photographs and countless notes, only to be met with immediate and cold silence. His groundbreaking work was never formally published. His academic funding was quietly and completely revoked. Years later, he privately confided in a trusted friend that he had received a mysterious, private letter from deep within the Vatican archives. It simply stated certain truths cannot be physically shaped to fit familiar forms. But the statue itself still stands there. Local priests say that every year on the same specific night in early spring, the intense moonlight passes directly through the chapel window and rests precisely on the child's face. Pilgrims who gather claim it feels like the whole earth itself is holding its breath in anticipation. And in recent years, more people have come not to simply pray for miracles, but to silently witness a mystery that no one dares to fully explain. Because this is not the Madonna of stained glass and gilded crowns. This is a mother who remembers something far older than any cathedral, a mother who, in quiet, dark stone, seems to gently whisper, "He walked here too." And perhaps that is precisely what grants her such immense power. Not what she openly says, but what the Church has stubbornly refused to say about her. Far beyond the small chapel walls, in the steep valleys where winding rivers curve like script through the hills of Amhara, another compelling story lives on. It is not permanently carved or carefully painted. It is not written down in any known book, but the local elders still faithfully tell it. Beside warm cooking fires and under skies completely filled with stars, they speak of the man who came from the north. He was not a king. He rode no camel, wore no cloak of gold, and carried no crown. He walked completely barefoot, carrying only a simple staff carved with strange markings. His eyes were fundamentally kind, but held a deep, distant look as if they had witnessed too much suffering. He arrived in the season of heavy rains, when the rough roads became rushing rivers and the skies trembled with thunderous noise. The villagers did not know what to initially make of him. At first he requested nothing. He offered no official title. But when people carefully approached him, they found that their chronic pain was mysteriously eased. A mother who had completely lost her voice began to suddenly sing. A boy with a severely broken leg stood up and instantly ran. And yet the man requested no money, no food, not even basic shelter. He simply stated, "Love is the only law I carry." This potent phrase, spoken in a soft tongue that was neither Amharic nor Ge'ez, echoed powerfully throughout the village. One elder who had studied forgotten languages during his time in Gondar claimed the words were closest to ancient Aramaic. The man stayed for only 3 days. On the final morning, he sat beneath a massive fig tree and told a single, profound story. It was about a tiny seed planted in dry, cracked soil, a seed that should not have possibly grown, but it did, because a small child believed in its potential. He ended the tale with a quiet, knowing smile and said, "Faith is not what you actively hold, it is what ultimately holds you." Then he quietly walked away, disappearing into the morning mist. Decades later, a travelling priest visited the village, diligently gathering local oral histories. When he heard this incredible story, he became perfectly still. He opened his worn leather satchel and carefully pulled out a small image, a depiction of Jesus teaching beneath a massive tree. The villagers stared at it for a long time. One of the oldest women finally whispered, "That is him, but younger." The priest said nothing at all. That night, he wrote in his private journal, "If what they say is truly correct, then the Gospels are missing more than just years. They are missing a pivotal witness." The Vatican never responded to his report. But in the village, the powerful fig tree still stands. Its fruit is famously said to be sweeter than any other in the entire region. And children are still regularly told the story of the man who walked from the north, healed without physical touch, and requested absolutely nothing in return. Because some truly believe he was much more than a mere traveller. They believe he was returning home. But if he did, if his powerful presence truly echoed across Ethiopia's steep hills and deep valleys, then why did no one in a position of power ever openly speak of it? Why did the Church, with all its global reach, never definitively confirm what so many people quietly whispered? In 1968, the world's attention focused as two powerful leaders stood closely side by side. One was dressed in gold vestments, the other in pure white. Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, the Lion of Judah, host to legends far older than Rome, and Pope Paul VI, the public voice of the Vatican, shepherd of over 1 billion faithful souls. Their meeting was undeniably historic. It was officially presented as a strong gesture of unity between two ancient, important branches of Christianity. Photographs were taken, hands were formally shaken, and official prayers were exchanged. But there was absolutely no mention of what the Ethiopian church privately remembered. There was no word spoken of the traveller, the legendary teacher. The deep stories passed down in song and carefully carved in stone. The Pope said nothing at all about the Black Madonna. The Emperor made no mention of the man who walked barefoot through his ancestors' ancient lands. Behind closed doors, however, there were faint whispers. Members of the delegation noted that Haile Selassie had presented the Pope with a carefully prepared scroll. Not a gift of art or diplomacy, but a simple translation, copied by hand, of an old Amharic folk tale that described a foreign man of peace who came during a terrible famine and healed the sick without ever speaking a word. The scroll was delivered in complete privacy. No cameras were present. No one ever saw it again. A week later, the Vatican issued a formal public summary of the visit. It heavily praised the harmony between the churches, spoke warmly of unity and peace, and celebrated the shared roots of their faith. But one single sentence stood out starkly. No historical matters of divergence were discussed. That cryptic phrase immediately puzzled historians. What specific matters of divergence were intentionally avoided, no one officially explained. The press did not question it. And yet in the months that followed, several Ethiopian churches received quiet internal instructions to entirely refrain from unauthorized retellings of non-biblical traditions. One local priest who had once served near Lalibela wrote in his journal that he was explicitly warned not to share stories of the teacher who came before Rome. He dutifully obeyed, but before finally sealing his writings, he added a final thought. If two men of God can meet and still choose to say nothing, then perhaps silence is the heaviest chain of all. To the entire world, the papal visit was peaceful, a success. But to those who listened very closely, it was something else entirely. A critical moment when the truth stood right in the room, officially clothed in tradition and diplomacy, only to be quietly escorted out before it could actually speak its name. The scroll was never again mentioned, and the man from the north, the one said to have returned, was left once more to the deep silence. But that silence did not originate in the modern era. It had roots, ancient, deep ones. Roots that clearly reached back to the late 18th century, when the Vatican made a fateful decision that would irrevocably change the course of its relationship with Ethiopia forever. It was the year 1782. The world was rapidly changing, empires relentlessly expanding. Europe's tenuous hold over distant lands was tightening like a heavy net, and the Church, as it always did, moved quietly alongside this expansion. Jesuit missionaries had been actively working in Ethiopia for nearly 200 years. The mission was initially to change minds, to make converts. Yet, once fully immersed, many of the newcomers transformed into something unexpected. They became observers, listeners, and sometimes even preservers of the very narratives they were sent to destroy. It was these unsettling narratives that compelled the Vatican to respond. Dispatches started reaching Rome from Jesuit stations deep within the Ethiopian highlands. These were anything but typical status reports. They spoke of local customs that mirrored details of Jesus' wisdom long before the faith officially arrived in the area. They detailed emblems preceding the church, yet perfectly consistent with gospel stories. In one instance, a priest wrote of an elder who recited a prayer in Aramaic, a tongue he claimed came from a man who instructed by the river but who did not establish churches. That single phrase, "did not establish churches," sent shockwaves through the Vatican. The power of the Church had always depended on its structure, on apostolic succession, on the unbroken chain from Peter to the Pope, carefully established through history and sacred text. If a parallel tradition existed, claiming the same sacred origin but operating outside that official lineage, it would not just be a matter of theological argument. It would jeopardize the absolute authority of the Vatican. A resolution was therefore enacted. A confidential directive, sealed with a crimson wax imprint, was dispatched to all Jesuit missions in Ethiopia. Its instruction was simple: withdraw all discourse concerning Ethiopian faith systems. Stop all inquiries. Reassign personnel effective immediately. Some Jesuits complied, others refused. Those who opposed the order were recalled. A few were entirely removed from records. One, Father Matteo Leone, reportedly burned his personal writings before boarding a vessel bound for Rome. Witnesses recorded his final words as a sermon ending with the sentence, "Truth may be forbidden, but it never forgets." The Ethiopian church, for its part, continued on its centuries-old path, chanting hymns older than memory, safeguarding ancient texts no one else could read, and transmitting stories that needed no papal validation to endure. The missionaries departed, their questions unresolved, their discoveries tucked away. But the resulting silence was not the conclusion. It was the genesis of something different, the silent internment of a truth either too delicate or too dangerous for the Vatican to openly acknowledge. And somewhere in those mountains, under the shadow of the acacia trees, the narrative remained vital even after the Jesuits had vanished. Centuries later, on one of those hills, a parchment was unearthed, wrapped in leather, and concealed beneath a loose rock in the wall of an isolated monastery. The monks who discovered it named it the Gospel of the Lion. No one could determine how long it had been there. The outer cover was fragile with age, and the ink had faded in spots. But the language was immediately recognized. Ge'ez, the sacred language of Ethiopia. What perplexed the monks, however, was not the writing but the essence behind the words. It lacked the tone of Matthew or Mark, Luke or John. This gospel had the rhythm of an oral chronicle, a cadence of repetition and resonance, like something intended to be spoken around a fire, not read in quiet solitude. At the core of the text was a figure never named, only described. He walked beside lions, it stated, and they did not fear him. In the introductory section, the teacher arrives not at a temple but at the border of a wilderness. He imparts wisdom by listening. He brings about healing not by contact but simply by being present. The hungry receive sustenance without food. The injured are comforted without touch. And at one point, deep within the scroll, a scene appears unlike any found in the New Testament. A lion is caught in a hunter's trap. Villagers gather, too terrified to approach it. The teacher steps forward, kneels, and speaks to the creature. No command is given, no miracle performed, only ordinary words. Slowly, the lion lowers its head. He releases the trap's mechanism, and the lion walks free. Then comes the sentence that has intrigued every scholar who has encountered it. He who tames no beast but frees it, walks not in dominion, but in truth. That single statement was enough to provoke endless discussion. Was it a metaphor, a spiritual lesson, or something else entirely? When the scroll was discreetly shown to a visiting Jesuit early in the 1900s, he made one simple note in his diary. This gospel does not pursue power, it seeks remembrance. The scroll was never submitted to the Vatican archives. The monks kept it secreted away. They feared what would occur if it were removed, translated and judged by those who knew nothing of its origin. But one single copy, a meticulous, hand-copied translation, was created and given to a scholar in Gondar, where it remains under lock and key. The Vatican has never acknowledged that the document exists, yet the title remains carved into the stone shelf where the scroll was first discovered. Not in gaze, not in Latin, but in a language older than both, inscribed with charcoal and still visible. The Gospel of the Lion. And those who have heard its stories all agree on the same thing. It does not sound like a story that was written. It sounds like one that was inherited. That was the fear shared quietly by a soldier in 1943, huddled among the ruins of a religious school just outside Asmara. Conflict had swept through the streets, fire had ravaged the library, but in the faint light of ash and cinder something drifted through the air. A half-burned page carried on the wind. He reached for it with a trembling hand, assuming it was nothing more than another scorched remnant. But as the smoke cleared, he saw what he held. A tattered piece of parchment, older than the structure itself. Its edges were blackened, but the ink still held fast to the centre. 2 lines in Ge'ez, and beneath them a design, a lion's head sketched in a single brush stroke, encircled by stars. The soldier understood none of the Ethiopian languages, but he kept the fragment, tucked it into his jacket, and carried it until the war's end. Years later, while recuperating in a small clinic near Florence, he showed it to a nurse whose grandfather had been a missionary. She drew a sharp breath when she saw it. The first line, she explained, was a prayer, but the second line was entirely different. It was not a religious verse, but a declaration. The teacher came with no scrolls, only fire and a voice that burned without smoke. That particular phrase circulated quietly within certain theological circles. It did not correspond to any known canonical text, nor any apocryphal document. Yet there was an undeniable sense of antiquity about it. Not written by someone attempting to imitate the past, but by someone who had been present. The Vatican never acknowledged the fragment, but a scholar from the Pontifical Biblical Institute was sent to examine it in private. After barely 20 minutes, he insisted it be handed over for more detailed examination. The soldier declined. That evening, his room was broken into. Nothing else was taken, only the fragment. He never saw it again. But 1 week later, the same scholar delivered a public address in Rome on the hazards of misplaced religious narratives. During his speech, he paused, looked down at his notes, and murmured, almost to himself, "Some flames are not meant to be remembered." The audience mistook it for an eloquent figure of speech, but those aware of the fragment wondered if he had witnessed something more profound. There are whispers, impossible to verify and unconfirmed, that the fragment endured, that a second duplicate had been made and hidden. Some claim it resides in a private monastery in Eritrea, safeguarded by monks who speak sparingly and write less often. They do not speak of fire, but when travellers inquire if the teacher ever walked their peaks, they smile and respond that he left no residue, only warmth. Because occasionally what is discovered in the blaze is not what is consumed, it is what resists destruction. That was the lesson a young mapmaker named Luca Benedetti realised in the spring of 1924 when he was invited to work on the Vatican's most ambitious and secretive undertaking, the creation of a definitive biblical atlas. This atlas, funded directly by the Holy See, was intended to map every verifiable location connected to the life of Jesus, from his birth in Bethlehem to his final days in Jerusalem. Dozens of experts, theologians and historians were assembled. The maps were designed to be intricate, beautifully produced and strictly adhering to Scripture. But Luca noticed something peculiar as he worked late one night, cross-referencing older drafts with newer revisions. One of the earlier documents, filed at the back of a binder marked Unverified Sources, displayed a faint red line extending far beyond the established pathways. It departed from Egypt, crossed the territories once known as Nubia, and curved into what was clearly northern Ethiopia. The route was simply labelled the Southern Itinerary. Initially he thought it was an oversight, but as he traced it repeatedly he saw that the line connected with documented ancient trade roads. Along the path were subtle notes in Latin. He spoke here. The healer walked this path. Silence begins at the well. These notes were deliberately omitted from the final printed versions. One note in particular struck him. Near the city of Aksum, a circle was drawn in gold ink. Within it, in barely decipherable Latin, were the words, "He did not stay, he returned." Luca presented the draft to his supervisor, a senior editor from the Vatican Library. The man gazed at it for an extended moment, then silently took it from him, folded it neatly and placed it in a desk drawer. "This is not for the atlas," he stated. "But it is part of the documentation," Luca insisted. "It is part of a memory we are choosing not to illustrate," came the reply. The completed atlas was released the following year. It was hailed across Europe as the most authoritative mapping of biblical geography ever produced. But the Southern Itinerary was nowhere to be found. no record of it remained. Years later, Luca would write to a friend, a professor of theology in Lisbon. In the letter, he recounted the memory and concluded with a single sentence. Sometimes the truth is not erased. It is simply left off the map. That single page was never recovered, but echoes of it persist among those who study the hidden routes, the ones that travel not north or west, but toward the forgotten regions of the south, where the voice of a teacher may still resonate in the peaks, unmarked by print but never completely forgotten. Because not every journey was mapped to be followed. Some were mapped to be concealed. That is what the last witness of Gondar believed. Her name was Sister Miriam, and for most of her existence she never departed the hilltop convent where she was born, worshipped, and aged. The stone chapel where she served overlooked the city of Gondar, its roofs clustered like faded gems beneath the high African sun. There were no access roads leading to the convent, only trails worn smooth by centuries of devoted walkers. Sister Miriam had never granted an interview, never written her signature on anything outside of church registries. But in the winter of 1972, she spoke quietly and only once to a young student named Elias, who had travelled there to learn the ancient chants. He had not anticipated a history lesson. He came for music. What he received was a recollection. They sat near the convent's eastern boundary, where the breeze carried the perfume of frankincense from the prayer hall. She was counting prayer beads when she glanced up and said, "He read from no scrolls." Elias assumed she was quoting scripture, but she shook her head. "I saw him," she stated, "not with these eyes, but with the eyes of my ancestors. My grandmother's grandmother saw him, and so did her mother before her." Elias listened as she described a visitor who arrived during a severe drought. He was barefoot, his garment worn, his hands gentle, yet weathered by dust. He did not speak the local dialect at first, but he listened to people. Children followed him. The infirm sought him out. Sister Miriam spoke of a night when the stars were exceptionally bright, and the man stood silently beside a tree that is now extinct. The villagers offered him water, and he refused it, saying, "The well is not dry, it is only waiting to be acknowledged." Elias asked if she believed this man was Jesus. She smiled softly. "I trust the stories we are permitted to tell, and I trust the stories we are not permitted to tell." Years afterward, following Sister Miriam's passing, Elias returned to the convent. He examined the chapel's walls, the old hymn books, the carved benches for any sign of her tale. He discovered nothing. But near the altar, beneath the paving stone that marked her customary place of prayer, he observed something unusual. A single word faintly etched into the stone with what appeared to be the tip of a needle. It meant footprint in her language. No one could determine when it had been carved, but those closest to her maintained that she never wrote anything down, only remembered. And when asked why the Vatican had never accepted these local traditions, Elias would later conclude, "Because to accept one footprint is to admit there was a root, and roots, once acknowledged, can no longer be hidden." Bishop André understood this truth all too well. And perhaps that is why his narrative ended as it did. He was not Ethiopian. He was born in Krakow in 1910, raised under the towering presence of old cathedrals and harsh winters. But it was neither stone nor dogma that captivated him. It was inquiry. By the time he was ordained, his sermons were already attracting unwanted attention, not for what he asserted, but for what he dared to question. In 1954, Bishop André was assigned to the Vatican's Interfaith Correspondence Division, a position that granted him access to correspondence from around the globe. That is when he first recognized the recurring themes, references to a nomadic teacher who performed healings without ceremony, accounts that originated not from Rome or Athens, but from the mountains of East Africa. He requested permission to study the Ethiopian documents. His superiors hesitated, then quietly granted approval. provided he kept his research strictly confidential. He failed to do so. In 1958, Bishop André delivered an address at a small seminary in southern France. It was meant to be private, but someone made a recording. In that talk, he presented an idea so radical that even his strongest supporters advised caution. He proposed that early Christianity may not have solely radiated outward from the apostles, but that it may have converged with other truths arriving from other regions. He hinted that Jesus himself may have journeyed to Ethiopia, and more provocatively he suggested the royal lineage of Ethiopia may carry what he termed a whisper of the Nazarene. Within weeks, he was summoned back to Rome. No official explanation was given. Then came the silence. For over a year, Bishop André's name disappeared from all church publications. His last known letter was dated December 1959. In it, he wrote to a colleague, "If you pursue the truth too far from the main path, do not be surprised if the path vanishes beneath your feet." 3 months later, his body was found at the base of a cliff near Castel Gandolfo. The official finding was accidental death, but those who knew him had their doubts. He never took hikes. He suffered from a fear of heights, and his briefcase, always with him, always secured, was never recovered. One page from his notes, copied before his death, survived. It was a hand-drawn diagram illustrating a tree with roots that branched in 2 directions, one toward Jerusalem, the other toward Axum. Above it, a question: what if both branches began in the same soil? The Vatican never commented on his death, but in a passageway near the archives, someone once etched a Latin sentence into the edge of a staircase railing. It was erased quickly, but not before someone wrote it down. Qui querit veritatem perdet tectum. He who seeks the truth may forfeit the roof over his head. That was the cryptic sentence written on a folded slip of paper tucked inside a black marble container lined with velvet. A container that was never meant to be opened again. It was found by chance, or so the account maintains. During a standard maintenance project in the subterranean levels of the Vatican Apostolic Palace in the early 1980s, a crew of workers was assigned to reinforce the foundation beneath a storage vault, a space that had not been accessed for many decades. The stone walls were damp, the air thick with the smell of dust and old wax. Most of what they unearthed consisted of obsolete ceremonial vestments, corroded incense vessels, and forgotten financial ledgers. Yet, far back in the room's corner, shielded by a ruined screen, it lay. The vessel was utterly unique within that space. It was black marble, finely smoothed, with no marks upon its surface. It possessed neither clasps nor joints. Still, it yielded easily, as though it awaited their presence. Inside, covered in fine cloth and fastened with crimson cord, was a container for a sacred item, not gold nor silver, but something far more intriguing. It was crafted from acacia wood, aged, cracked, and darkened by the passage of time. Attached was a label written in Latin, indistinct and partially detached. The initials were almost gone, TSI. Initially its meaning was lost to all, but a scholar, summoned to inspect the contents, stopped short upon seeing it. His hands began to shake. He offered no explanation at first, only breathed the phrase twice. The Southern Itinerary. It was a reference long forgotten. It had been seen only once, printed on a provisional page of the Vatican's unreleased map collection, charting a route said to follow the travels of an itinerant sage south from Judea deep into the land of Ethiopia. The reliquary held 2 well-worn sandals, brittle with age, a single band of fabric stitched with a design foreign to European eyes, and a small, sealed scroll, unopened, its wax seal whole. The scholar wished to examine it, but by sunrise, the following morning, the container was missing. Removed, completely gone. No one logged its transit, no paperwork existed, not even a simple inventory entry. The crew was reassigned and the rooms secured, but one of the labourers, a man named Sergio, would later relate to his son what he witnessed. He detailed the sandals precisely, and he insisted, despite the others' ridicule, that one still held fine dust within its stitching. Not Roman dust, he specified. It carried the scent of dry gusts, of sun-baked rock. When asked if he had touched the scroll, Sergio quietly shook his head. He replied, "Some truths are best left preserved in quiet. However, even quiet leaves traces." That was the brief statement found inscribed on a slip of paper hidden beneath the silk lining inside a black marble container. A container that should never have been opened. Not again. It came to light by sheer chance, or so the account maintains. During routine preservation work in the Vatican Apostolic Palace's lower chambers in the early 1980s, a crew was assigned to stabilize the foundation beneath a storage vault, a room untouched for decades. The walls were wet, the air dense with residue and the fragrance of beeswax. Most items recovered were ancient clerical robes, tarnished censers and overlooked ledgers. But in the far back of the room, hidden by a degraded dividing wall, they discovered it. The container was unlike any other object in the room. Black marble, meticulously smooth, completely unblemished on its surface. It had no hinges, no visible joints, yet it opened effortlessly, as if awaiting its moment. Inside, wrapped in linen and tied off with red thread, was a reliquary. It wasn't made of gold or silver, but something far more rare. It was crafted from acacia wood, ancient, splintered, and marked with years. A Latin tag was affixed to it, faded and peeling at one edge. The letters were nearly illegible, TSI. Initially, no one could decipher the meaning, but an archivist who had been summoned to inspect the contents froze when he saw it. His hands visibly shook. He spoke no words at first, then only whispered the cryptic phrase, twice. The Southern Itinerary. It was a phrase from long ago. It had only ever appeared once on a sketch page in the Vatican's restricted atlas, a passage rumoured to trace the path of an itinerant teacher from Judea south into the deep lands of Ethiopia. The contents of the container were two ancient sandals desiccated by time, a singular piece of cloth embroidered with a pattern entirely unknown in Europe, and a minute scroll, sealed, never opened, the wax entirely unbroken. The archivist intended further examination, but by morning the container had vanished, taken, disappeared. There was no authorization signature, no file entry, not even a report of its placement. The labourers were moved elsewhere and the room sealed, yet one of them, a man named Sergio, would later recount to his son what he had witnessed. He gave a detailed account of the sandals, and he swore, despite the scepticism of others, that one still retained grit lodged in its material. Not dust from Rome, he affirmed. It smelled of arid winds, of scorching stone. When questioned if he had touched the scroll, Sergio declined. "No," he said. "Certain things are meant to remain untouched by human hands. But even silence leaves evidence. And somewhere, possibly still, that black marble container rests closed once more, safeguarding a journey that resisted disappearance. That very journey may have left one of its most peculiar signs, far from the Vatican's secure chambers, marked not on ancient parchment but etched into the very rock of a church wall in Lalibela, Ethiopia. It was the spring of 1979 when a Belgian architect named Clara de Wilde arrived at the celebrated rock-cut churches of Lalibela. These structures were not built with conventional materials. They were excavated vertically directly from the red volcanic bedrock, forming a cross-shaped complex of sanctuaries, passages and concealed recesses. Clara's purpose was not devotion but preservation. Her mission was to catalogue structural defects in the ancient stone. But what she found was quite unexpected. A carving so worn it had nearly merged with the surrounding rock. At first, it appeared to be little more than a weathered ornamental feature, barely discernible in the early light. But as her fingers traced its outlines, a figure began to emerge, a line of holy figures, cloaks flowing, heads bowed in reverence. And in their midst, taller than the others, stood a man whose portrayal differed from the local Ethiopian style. His facial features were distinct, a thinner nose, eyes set deeper into the face. His garment hung loosely in natural folds, unlike the formal attire of the figures nearby. Most notably were his feet, bare and slightly elevated, as if he were walking through the saints rather than simply standing with them. Clara created a sketch of the carving, and upon her return to Belgium she presented the drawing to a colleague skilled in religious art. He noticed a peculiarity. The saints positioned on either side were recognized Ethiopian martyrs, but the central figure was a mystery. He lacked a halo. He did not bear a cross. He held nothing at all. Above the figures, a word had been carved, faded, fractured, and partially lost to the centuries. Mihalawi, the one who traverses. Clara contacted a professor in Rome seeking historical context. 2 weeks later, her query was met not with answers but with a courteous rebuff. The Vatican, she was informed, held no record of such a figure in its historical files, but the image of the carving lingered in her mind. Years passed, and Clara returned to Lalibela. The carving was gone, the wall surface smoothed and repaired. No one could recall authorizing the action. No one admitted to performing the restoration. But Clara kept her sketch, and, in her final written observations, composed before her death, she articulated her conviction. The man was not positioned among the saints. He was moving through them, traversing churches, traversing narratives, traversing different versions of the truth. And perhaps that is what caused the greatest alarm for the guardians of history, because those who move between boundaries are never truly lost. They simply await discovery. Because once the origin is questioned, then everything that came afterward must also be examined, including the very essence that defines the story. This is the point where private conversations grow louder, not within formal addresses or papal pronouncements, but in sealed correspondences, restricted records, and hidden family histories. Among the most rigorously protected of these Vatican secrets is a notion so ancient it predates the Crusades. The belief that Jesus might have left behind not only his teachings but descendants, the bloodline theory. In most Western settings it is dismissed as fabricated, a plot device for novels and conspiracy theories. But in Ethiopia the interpretation is radically different. There, isolated monastic communities and royal chronicles quietly speak of a union not recorded in the official Gospels, but preserved in spoken history. The account of a man from the north, cloaked in desert dust and profound knowledge, who arrived during a famine and healed without medicinal herbs. He was granted lodging by a woman rumoured to be of royal lineage, tracing her ancestry back to the line of Solomon. And though his visit was brief, her child was born with unique eyes and a birthmark on his hand, a star etched into the skin. In the ancient city of Axum, scrolls lie protected in dimly lit vaults, too fragile to unroll. Yet among the monks, a specific name is passed down, Josephon the Bright, a child who was said to have spoken in spiritual metaphors before he learned to write, and who vanished before his 12th year. Some insist he is merely a myth. Others claim his name appears in the footnotes of 3 distinct Jesuit reports written centuries apart. The Vatican, as expected, has never acknowledged this assertion, but a quiet change occurred. In the early 1900s, a scholar named Father Arturo Benedetti was granted special permission to access the Ethiopian Royal Archives following a diplomatic mission. What he discovered remains largely unknown, but he returned to Rome visibly changed. He retired from public life soon after and spent his remaining years in contemplative silence. Yet one telling fragment survived, scrawled on the back of a small receipt found among his private possessions. It read, "If the Nazarene's blood touched the Solomonic line, the papal claim is not the oldest, only the loudest." the implications were immense. If any part of it were accurate, it would mean that a sacred lineage existed beyond the Church's dominion. A bloodline originating not in Bethlehem or Nazareth, but anchored in the African highlands, sustained not by institutional power, but by the force of memory. And in the view of those who feared it, that was perhaps the ultimate danger, because sacred artifacts can be secured, scrolls can be destroyed, but lineage remembers. And sometimes it remembers what the rest of the world has intentionally forgotten. That memory, unarticulated, yet deeply resonant, constitutes the core of one of the Church's longest-standing anxieties. Not an outright heresy, but a disconcerting possibility. The notion that Christ did not remain confined within the boundaries established by Rome, that his travel extended past the ramparts of Jerusalem, beyond the familiar slopes of Galilee, beyond the reach of the Roman Empire, and into lands where no Roman banner had ever flown. Christ outside Rome. It is not official doctrine, not even a whisper the Vatican has ever formally addressed. But it is a silent presence that has tracked the Church since its inception. For every canonical gospel, for every council that delineated the boundaries of faith, there were accounts excluded, routes left untrodden, paths allowed to gather dust. One of the most disturbing of these narratives originates not in Africa, but from an unlikely setting, an aged Jesuit seminary in southern Spain. In the year 1932, a young theologian named Elias Duarte found a collection of letters, yet to be translated, copied from an older manuscript thought to date from the 13th century. One particular letter described an anonymous man who taught solely through questions. He described the kingdom not as a physical location, but as something concealed beneath one's own skin. And he departed, the writer noted, toward the land of Kush, where the sun dances between stone and fire. Duarte presented the letter to his senior colleagues. He was warned against pursuing the topic. A month later, he requested a transfer from the seminary and lived the remainder of his life in solitude. But he never forgot that evocative phrase. The sun dances between stone and fire. Years later, when a missionary returning from Ethiopia used that precise description to characterize the area near the Blue Nile, Duarte simply gave a nod. He had understood the truth all along. The Vatican naturally had strategic reasons. To establish the faith's centre in Rome was to create solidarity, clear identity, and strict control. But if Christ's mission extended into Africa not as a mere story, but as verifiable history, then the supremacy of Rome was not a sacred plan. It was a matter of historical convenience. Some historians now suspect this fear influenced decisions in ways the public never grasped. Decisions regarding which texts were canonized, which were labelled apocryphal, which territories were designated as holy, and which were not. In silence, these decisions accumulated like foundation blocks, constructing the colossal authority of the Church. But beneath those foundation stones, the path may have gone in a different direction. Not exclusively through Jerusalem, but down across deserts and into valleys where sandals left impressions in red dust, where the local language sounded simultaneously foreign and familiar, where the teacher may have walked without protection and unrecognized among a populace who retained the memory but were never asked to share it. And perhaps that is why the narrative remains obscured, because it dares to suggest that the original truth was never secured in Rome. It simply continued onward. And in that quiet departure rests a fundamental challenge the Vatican has never been willing to fully confront. A challenge not just to historical record, but to the very concept of its authority. Because if Christ taught outside the established route, if he shared wisdom and healing in places where Peter never set foot, then the entire concept of apostolic succession becomes profoundly uncertain. This is the question that penetrates the core of the Church's foundation. Apostolic authority, the uninterrupted lineage extending from Peter to every subsequent pope. It is this continuous thread that links Rome to the divine, that makes its declarations more than mere tradition. it makes them truth. But what if that thread was never the only one in existence? Hidden within the confidential papers of Cardinal Sebastiani, who served briefly in the early 1900s, is a single statement that has never been released to the public. It reads, "If another line was taught and left no bishop, then who carries its authority?" It was not merely a philosophical question. He had just returned from Ethiopia after visiting a small monastery near Gondar. There, an aged monk had presented him with a stone tablet. On its face was an inscription in both Ge'ez and Greek. The translated message, "The teacher gave no seat, only a path." This phrase deeply troubled the cardinal. It suggested that Christ's teaching in Ethiopia, if it occurred, did not adopt the Roman hierarchical structure. There were no titles, no formal assignments, just a simple, direct transfer of wisdom, which would render it uncontrollable. And perhaps more dangerously, it would make it inherently equal to Rome's claim. For centuries, the Vatican has meticulously protected the narrative that Rome is the primary conduit through which divine grace flows, that Peter was the foundation, and that every truth must pass beneath his shadow. But if Ethiopia received the teaching directly, without Peter, without Paul, then it suggests that spiritual authority does not belong to a specific city, but to the collective memory of a people. It fundamentally reorders the religious hierarchy. It implies that the keeper of ultimate truth might not wear garments trimmed in gold, but rough cloth aged and stained. It suggests that the most sacred altar might not be situated beneath St. Peter's Basilica, but within a cave high in the Simeon Mountains. And it means the lineage descending from Christ is not a written list of names and offices, but quiet footsteps in the dust, soft, elusive, nearly forgotten. The Vatican has never publicly addressed this possibility, but silence serves as its own form of response, because power is not inherited, it is asserted, and authority, once fundamentally questioned, must either defend its position or dissolve into the very mystery it sought to contain. And that mystery may reside beneath something more ancient than the Vatican itself, a throne established not from cold marble, but from ancient prophecy, the Lion Throne of Ethiopia. To the outside world, it is merely a symbolic title, a poetic reference to the Solomonic dynasty. But within the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, the Lion of Judah is not just a symbol of royal strength. It signifies a divine heritage, a bloodline believed to trace its origin back to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And in the most carefully guarded conversations to someone even more sacred. Certain Ethiopian myths tell of a personal visit, not by an apostle, but by the teacher himself. They speak of an intimate union, whether spiritual or physical, between Jesus and a woman descended from royal ancestry, and from that union a child was born, a child whose subsequent line would one day occupy the Lion Throne. It is this singular possibility that has profoundly unsettled the Church in Rome for centuries, because if the Solomonic line claimed not only David but also Jesus as part of its ancestry, then authority did not stream solely through Peter, it flowed in parallel derived from blood, memory and the land itself, not through appointed bishops, but through kings, through emperors. In the year 1955, during the reign of Emperor Haile Selassie, a Vatican emissary was dispatched to Ethiopia under the guise of promoting interfaith dialogue. What he brought back was far more disturbing than anyone in Rome had anticipated. He had been shown a scroll never before revealed to foreign eyes. It was guarded by a single monk who had taken a profound vow of total silence. The scroll was written in Ge'ez and was only read aloud. It described a luminous one who walked with fire beneath his feet, who conversed with the elements and knew the name of every creature. But the final statement is what completely shook the envoy, and he planted a seed in the house of Sheba, and that seed continues to move among people. The scroll was never permitted to leave the monastery, but the memory of its contents travelled back to the Vatican, where it was recorded in a restricted file labelled Only Lioness. Highly sensitive to this day, no public record confirms the file's specifics, but those who have worked in the Vatican archives report the name is still uttered in hushed tones, usually with extreme caution, sometimes with deep reverence. Lioness. Not a place, not a person, but the lingering shadow of a legacy the Church can neither prove nor fully dismiss. Because if that seed did survive, if that bloodline still persists across time, then Rome may not be the sole city built upon holy ground. And the Lion Throne may safeguard a truth far older than the keys of Peter. That truth, some believe, is not completely lost, not destroyed, not buried deep, but concealed in plain sight, or rather in a reflected view. Inside the oldest sector of the Vatican Library, past walls of dust-covered ancient books and beneath ceilings adorned with forgotten saints, is a small, unlabelled, windowless room. But it contains an object few are ever granted permission to witness. Mirrors. Not the kind used for personal reflection or display, but finely polished silver discs set into the wooden walls, angled to capture the faint light, like stars embedded in frames. Most visitors pass by without a second thought. But in the private journals of a young archivist named Matteo Ricci, who worked briefly in the library in 1962, there is a quiet note describing a strange discovery. He wrote of finding a manuscript that was impossible to read under natural light, candlelight, or even the soft illumination of a lamp. Its writing appeared faint, almost erased, until, by accident, he held the pages close to one of the mirrored walls. And as the reflected light bounced back toward him, the ink appeared not in Latin, but in Ge'ez. The text described a teacher who walked between light and shadow, and who communicated in a mirrored language. It cautioned that his teachings were intended only for those who search through quiet contemplation, not outward pronouncement. Matteo, entirely captivated, attempted to make copies. The next morning, the manuscript was gone. He was subsequently transferred to another department. Some say the Vatican confiscated his notes, but a single page survives in a private archive in Florence, a quick sketch he drew from memory, not of the words, but of the arrangement of the mirrors on the wall. It resembled a distinct star pattern, or more specifically the lion constellation. In Vatican inner circles, this room is now referred to only by its codename Reflectorium, and according to one former custodian, it is only utilised on specific nights, during the Feast of the Transfiguration, during certain full moons, and sometimes on dates that do not correspond to the Roman calendar, but which do appear on the Ethiopian liturgical one. What the mirrors ultimately reveal, and what they were designed to conceal, remains undisclosed. The Church, when questioned, insists the room is merely decorative, a forgotten artistic choice. But secrets are often best hidden behind details too unusual to be asked about. And in a place like the Vatican, where truth wears the same robes as shadows, even a mirror can become a passage not just to the past, but to the full story just beyond it. That history stirred once more in the year 1967 in the remote hill country of northern Ethiopia, where a young deacon named Alim Tesfaye woke from a powerful dream he could not possibly explain. In 1967, deep in the quiet hill country of northern Ethiopia, a young deacon named Alim Tesfaye awoke from a dream he couldn't explain. At 22 years old, Alim had never left his province, never visited Rome, and had never studied Latin. Yet, what he recalled upon waking would soon resonate through the closed circles of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, eventually reaching the awareness of the Vatican. He insisted this vision was entirely unlike ordinary sleep. In the dream, he found himself in a desert, vast and arid, where acacia trees cast long shadows on sand that appeared to glow from within. A man approached him, barefoot, wearing a simple white robe, his eyes the colour of the morning sky. He carried no scrolls, no staff, no wealth. Still, Alim said he felt a greater spiritual presence in that stillness than in any mass he had ever attended. The man spoke not in Amharic, but in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical tongue. Yet Alim understood every single word. "Your faith began before Rome," the man stated, "and it will endure after." When Alim woke, his tears were not from fear, but from a profound feeling akin to memory, as if he had not experienced something new, but recalled something ancient. He confessed his experience to the abbot of his monastery, half expecting reprimand. Instead, the abbot became thoughtful. He informed Alim that a nearly identical dream had been recorded before, once in the 17th century and again in the early 1900s, always from devout men, always bearing the same message. A sacred figure had walked there long before the word of Christ reached Rome. The Vatican never officially acknowledged the account, but 1 year later, a Vatican scholar, Father Mauro Rinaldi, travelled to Ethiopia under the pretense of conducting linguistic research. According to a private letter found among his documents, he requested a brief meeting with Alim. What they discussed was never recorded. Upon his return to Rome, Father Rinaldi delivered a sealed envelope to the Pontifical Biblical Institute. It was marked Memoria Prima, or First Memory. It has never been opened. Alim remained at his monastery for decades, refusing all public invitations, but those who knew him said he always smiled when people asked about his dream. His only reply was, "He walked once in our soil, and his feet did not forget us." In a world where secrets are guarded by official silence, sometimes a single dream carries the deepest truth. And in the quiet hills of Ethiopia, one deacon still believed that history breathes not through documents, but through the soul. Those words travelled far beyond the monastery, catching the attention of curious minds in Ethiopia and eventually stirring interest within the marble corridors of Vatican City. Among the popes who passed through those sacred halls, one man came closer than any other to challenging the silence. His name was Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli, known globally as Pope John XXIII. It was the spring of 1963. The Second Vatican Council was in progress, seeking to modernise the Church's dialogue with the world, opening windows that centuries of caution had kept closed. Pope John, known for his kind eyes and quiet resolve, believed the Church must embrace truth, even when wrapped in deep mystery. One evening, in his private study, surrounded by old parchment and dim candlelight, he began composing a speech unlike any previous one. The pages still exist, stored not with his official addresses, but in a locked drawer inside the Vatican Apostolic Palace. They are in his careful, deliberate handwriting, filled with pauses, suggesting the immense weight of what he intended to say. He started not with dogma, but with a question. What if the Son of Man travelled farther than we realise? In the draft, he cited not only Ethiopian oral tradition, but also obscure ancient maps housed in the Vatican Library, folk hymns carried by the desert wind, and testimonies written in the curved script of Ge'ez. He did not assert certainty, but he called for open-mindedness, for recognising holiness found in lands long considered distant. He even quoted an Ethiopian proverb, "The river begins where the mountain humbles itself." The speech was never delivered. Days before its quiet release was planned, Pope John became ill. He died soon after, on June 3, 1963. The draft was sealed away. The drawer was closed and the Vatican resumed its normal operations. But some believe the message persists, not just in that locked drawer, but in the atmosphere of the council chamber itself, where he once presided. Cardinals who served him have whispered that he often spoke of the faith of the forgotten and believed the Church was strongest when it listened, rather than when it silenced. A retired Monsignor once recalled Pope John looking out his window the night before the scheduled address and murmuring, "They will not be ready, but one day they must be." In the quiet history of the Vatican, many secrets are hidden beneath stone and seal, but some remain between the lines, waiting for the right moment to be spoken. And perhaps the silence around this one was not denial, but perhaps it was grief. beneath the gravity of that memory, even the stones tremble, especially those buried deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica. There, in a realm most visitors never see, lies the Vatican necropolis, a city of shadow tombs resting beneath the most sacred ground in Christendom. Long before the Great Dome was built, long before pilgrims kissed the feet of bronze statues, this area was a cemetery. It was not initially a holy site, but a burial place for Roman dead, a quiet field of pagan and early Christian graves mixed together. In the late 1940s, as workers prepared to strengthen the basilica floor, they broke through a centuries-old wall and uncovered a world sealed by time. Tunnels, sarcophagi, faded frescoes, names etched in stone, and among them, something unexpected, something that seemed out of place. It was a small, almost forgotten burial chamber, tucked beneath a curved arch. The symbols on the walls were unfamiliar, neither Latin nor Greek. They were more flowing, more ancient, closely resembling a script found in Ethiopian monasteries, carved high into red cliffs. Next to the faded writing was a rough carving of a cross, not the Roman style but flared at the edges in the tradition of the Ethiopian church. In the centre of the chamber, surrounded by dry air and torchlight, lay a stone coffin. No name, no seal, just a dark stone slab and a small lion carved into its base. The workers were immediately ordered to stop. The chamber was sealed once more. Though the Vatican's official report mentioned an unclassified tomb, it provided no photographs, no drawings, no translations. But one of the labourers, a young man named Luca, kept a journal, which he passed to his granddaughter years later. The pages tell a different story. He wrote of a Vatican official arriving in haste, whispering to the supervisor. He wrote of 3 men entering the tomb in gloves and silence. He never saw what they removed, only that a box, heavy going in, left lighter. The granddaughter, now a historian, has since attempted to access the excavation records. They no longer exist, at least not in any accessible form, but what remains is the location. Beneath the altar, below St. Peter's bones, a layer hidden under reverence and stone, where one tomb, among many, challenges the official narrative. And there, in that silence, we confront the real fear. Not that the tomb exists, but that its occupant may not have been Roman, may not have been European, may not have been forgotten after all. And if that figure beneath the altar once walked the earth, perhaps he also left behind something more lasting, not in stone, but in colour. Just a short walk from the heart of Vatican City, in a forgotten corner of a crumbling 5th century basilica, there is a floor mosaic that has puzzled scholars for decades. It lies beneath layers of history, uncovered only during a routine renovation in the late 1960s. Dusty and faded, the image had been hidden by wooden planks and forgotten marble. When light finally illuminated it again, something strange emerged. At the centre of the mosaic is a man, not wearing Roman robes and not surrounded by a halo like the other saints. His skin is dark, his feet are bare, and he stands beneath an acacia tree. Animals surround him, including a lion and what seems to be a donkey. In his hands, he holds no book, no scroll, only what appears to be a carved walking staff. The most striking element is his face. Unlike the stylized figures typical of Roman art, this man's features are carefully rendered, almost lifelike. He looks different from the others. For decades, art historians simply claimed it was a local depiction of a missionary, perhaps a traveller from Alexandria. But a note found tucked into the margin of an early church ledger calls the figure Il Viaggiatore del Sud, the traveller from the south. That alone would not cause alarm. But beside the mosaic, almost invisible to a casual eye, is a narrow band of writing. Not Latin, not Greek, but an older script. Letters that match those found in Ge'ez, the sacred Ethiopian language. It took years before someone finally translated the complete ring of text, and when they did, only a few words were ever made public. This is the one who taught without letters, whose words set fire to the dust. It was never formally announced, and the mosaic is now kept under glass, marked restricted for structural preservation. But one retired Vatican archivist recalls his superior instructing him never to allow the image to be copied, photographed, or described in any official document. When asked why, the superior simply said, "Because no one wants to explain how that face got here before the missionaries ever arrived." And perhaps that is the question that lingers longest in the silent spaces between marble walls and candlelight prayers. What if the journey was real? What if he came not to be crowned, but simply to walk, to teach, to vanish, leaving only footprints behind in tile, in tomb, and in memory? Not far from that forgotten mosaic, deep beneath the basilica's shadowed wing, sits a small unadorned chamber. It is rarely mentioned in public records and appears on no tourist maps. The room is simple: stone walls, a single lamp, and a narrow altar marked with a brass plaque that reads, "From the South." At the centre of the altar rests a reliquary. Its shape is unusual. Unlike the ornate gold and silver boxes found elsewhere in the Vatican, this one is carved from dark cedar and rimmed with copper, showing signs of extreme age and weathering. Yet it is empty. There are no relics inside, no bone fragments, no scraps of cloth, no vial of ancient oil. Only a hollow, velvet-lined space and a faint, centuries-old scent of frankincense. The mystery of the reliquary is not merely its emptiness, but its survival. An entry from a 19th century Vatican inventory lists the item as relic box, origin unknown, brought from the African coast, possibly Axum. The same note includes a curious directive: preserve, do not display, do not inquire further. But someone did inquire further. A priest named Father Leone, known for his interest in the forgotten parts of church history, once spent a winter cataloguing relics removed during renovations. He wrote in his personal journal, now quietly stored in a seminary archive, that when he opened the box he expected a minor artifact. Instead, he found nothing and everything. Along the inside edge of the lid was a carved inscription, worn nearly smooth with age. He traced it with his fingers and copied what he could into the margin of his journal. The words were in crude Aramaic. He carried no burden but light, and left none but silence. After that entry, there are no more mentions of the reliquary in his notes. A few years later, Father Leone left the Vatican and returned to his family home in Sicily, where he lived the rest of his days in quiet retreat, refusing interviews and never speaking of his time in Rome. Today, the reliquary still rests beneath the basilica. Visitors walk above it without ever knowing it is there. A single candle burns nearby, replaced each week by a young seminarian who has been told only that it honours a traveller. And sometimes, late at night, footsteps approach the chamber. No words are spoken, no prayer is said aloud. Just the sound of someone kneeling beside an empty box, as though remembering something that was never meant to be forgotten. But some memories are kept alive in rituals not listed in any official calendar. Once a year, on a night without ceremony or announcement, a small door near the Vatican Library opens. The corridor beyond is narrow, lined with cold stone. No paintings, no gold, no sound except for the soft shuffle of robed figures moving in the dark. At the end of this hallway is a private chapel, unmarked, windowless, and used only for this single gathering. Inside, candles flicker on iron stands. The air is heavy with ancient incense. The scent is not Roman, not European. It carries notes of acacia, of distant mountains, of something older than the room itself. Then the Mass begins. But it is not in Latin, not in Italian. It is spoken in Amharic, the language of Ethiopia. The priest who leads the Mass is never named in public records. He wears no elaborate vestments, just a plain white robe tied with a red thread at the waist. He reads from a weathered book bound in cracked, faded leather. The writing inside is entirely in Ge'ez, Ethiopia's ancient liturgical script. The Mass itself follows a rhythm unfamiliar to Roman ears. The prayers are sung in low tones, the melody slow and haunting, echoing like a lullaby meant for all and for no one. The homily, if there is one, never speaks the name of Christ directly, but refers instead to the one who walked. Those who have heard fragments of it say it tells of a journey, a man with no wealth, no army, and no name among kings who passed through the hills of Cush during a great famine. He spoke to farmers, to weavers, to children. He carried no scroll. He healed with words, not hands. And then just as softly as it began, the Mass concludes. Each candle is snuffed out in silence. The priest kisses the corner of the book and leaves without a word. No blessing, no amen. Only the scent of the incense remains. Why does this Mass exist? Why is it unrecorded? Who are the handful of witnesses allowed to attend? No answers are provided. And yet this quiet ritual may be one of the oldest secrets the Vatican has ever preserved. A memory kept alive, not in marble, not in writing, but in voice, in a language that has never belonged to Rome, in a chapel that has no name. But there is another room, deeper still, one not intended for prayer. It is buried beneath the southern wing of the Apostolic Palace, accessible only by an unmarked stairwell, guarded by silence more than locks. It is not part of official tours. It appears on no map. The corridor leading to it is dimly lit, the air growing colder with each step, as though the past itself has been motionless for centuries. At the end of that passage lies a heavy wooden door, its frame carved with vines and thorns. No sign above it, no cross. Just one worn Latin phrase etched into the grain, for those without titles. Beyond that door is what only a handful of Vatican insiders call the Chamber of Unnamed Saints. There are no frescoes here, no gilded icons, just stone walls and carved names. 34 of them, each etched into the surface in fading scripts. Some Latin, some Greek, others older, unrecognizable even to the most skilled Vatican archivists. Each name is followed by a place and a date, but one stands apart. It is carved near the centre of the chamber, lower than the rest, almost as if added in secret after the others. It reads, "Of the Way." That is all. No name, no date, just the final words, "Of the Way." The Vatican officially dismisses the chamber as a forgotten memorial to early Christian martyrs, local heroes never canonized but respected nonetheless. A historical curiosity, nothing more. But certain whispers tell a different story. A former Vatican scholar, now long deceased, once hinted in a private letter that the names in the chamber may not all be martyrs. Some may have been travellers, messengers, even teachers, he claimed. The term "of the way" was used in ancient Ethiopia to describe one who bore light, who arrived during times of darkness, and who refused all titles. A man remembered not for his name, but for the path he walked. The church never responded to his letter. He was reassigned, weeks later, sent to a quiet post in northern France, where he died in an apparent accident. The letter was found in a locked drawer, never mailed. And so, the chamber remains cold, forgotten. But if you ever find yourself beneath the Apostolic Palace and feel a sudden hush come over the air, listen closely. You might hear footsteps, and perhaps, just perhaps, a voice without a name still walking the way. And yet a voice needs feet to carry it. Words may travel far. But the one who first spoke them must have walked a path unknown to most. In a dim display room beneath the treasury of the Vatican Museum, tucked behind jewelled crosses and papal tiaras, rests a glass case that rarely draws much attention. Its label reads, "Sandals, 1st century origin, donor unknown." Most visitors pass by without pausing, but a closer inspection reveals something the label omits. The leather is dark and weathered, yet still intact. Along the straps are tiny, almost invisible stitch patterns, unlike anything used in Roman or Hebrew craftsmanship of the time. A textile analyst years ago compared the stitching to traditional Ethiopian sandal-making techniques, specifically those used in the northern Tigray region. The curvature of the sole was also wider than Roman standards, better suited for rougher volcanic terrain. No record exists of how or when the Vatican acquired these sandals, but there is a handwritten note locked in a side drawer of the curator's office. It was written by a Vatican historian named Lucia Bartelli, who served under Pope Paul VI. The note, never intended for public eyes, includes a single haunting line. They match the tracks carved into the stones of Aksum. In Ethiopia's ancient city of Aksum, there are stone paths so old even the locals call them the Walk of the Light. Some say the stones bear shallow, worn impressions of feet that once walked the way before it had a name. Lucia had seen them, touched them, and when she returned to Rome she compared their shape to the sandals under glass. They matched. Lucia requested permission for further study of the sandals. Her request was denied. 2 months later, she was transferred to the section of the archives dealing with relics of lesser significance. Her report was buried under unrelated documents, indexed under Eastern footwear. But a janitor, years later, remembered something strange. Late one evening, as he was sweeping outside the exhibit room, he found the glass case open. No alarm had gone off, no visitor logs showed any appointment. But on the velvet lining inside the case, he swore he saw something odd. A trail of fine dust, dark as volcanic ash. He wiped it away. He said nothing. But now, when the lights are off and the hall is empty, some say they hear the faint sound of sandals on stone. Soft, slow, and still walking. That was how Father Emilio described the sound when he finally confessed by candlelight what he had kept silent for over 30 years. He was not a man of scandal or drama. In fact, most remembered him as quiet, gentle, always the last to leave evening mass, always the one to lock up the small chapel just off the edge of the Vatican gardens. He rarely spoke of his younger years in the priesthood, except to mention that he had once worked briefly in Ethiopia as part of a missionary rotation. But on one of his last nights, after his hands began to tremble and his eyesight had nearly faded, Father Emilio requested a private meeting with the archivist of relics. Not the head of theology, nor the bishop on duty, just the archivist, and only if they brought no pen, no tape recorder, no one else. The meeting took place in a small side room, with a single candle flickering between them. The story, they say, began not with words, but with a breath, a long, slow breath. And then came the confession. He came not to be crowned, Father Emilio whispered, but to be remembered in silence. The archivist asked who he meant. Emilio did not answer at first. Instead, he pulled a folded slip of cloth from his robe. It was a worn textile, pale and old, embroidered with a subtle sunburst design, an emblem absent from any standard Christian garment, yet well known to those who had explored the religious art of the Ethiopian tradition. The story followed immediately. Decades earlier, during a terrible drought, Emilio had journeyed to a secluded monastery carved into a cliff face high above the Blue Nile. The monks welcomed him warmly, even knowing he had come from Rome. There he witnessed a gathering after midnight, centred not on spoken sermons or scripture readings, but on chanting, a sound that was low, profound, nearly a hum. At the core stood an elderly monk who carried no holy book but a vessel of radiance, literally a small bronze bowl holding a flame, completely shielded from air currents or heat. And as the communal singing grew, the elder spoke softly but firmly. He passed through fire, he left no ashes, he touched the rock, and it became bread. These phrases were not part of the canon, not from any gospel Emilio had ever encountered, but every monk bowed low in respect, some even shedding tears when asked for whom they sang. The reply was invariably the same. The one who travelled from the north. Back in Rome, when Emilio attempted to document his experience in a letter, it was intercepted. He was commanded never to mention it again. And so he waited for decades until the flicker of candlelight and the deep silence finally allowed the truth to emerge. That was the sound Father Emilio used to describe the moment he finally confided by candlelight the secret he had kept for more than 30 years. He was not a man prone to drama or controversy. In fact, most people recalled him as quiet, gentle, always the last to leave evening mass, always the one who locked up the small sanctuary just off the Vatican gardens. He rarely spoke of his youth in the priesthood, except to mention he had once worked briefly in Ethiopia many years ago as part of a missionary rotation. But on one of his final evenings, after his hands began to tremble and his sight had almost gone, Father Emilio asked for a private audience with the archivist of relics. Not the head theologian nor the duty bishop, only the archivist, and only if they brought no writing implements, no recording device, and no other person. The meeting took place in a tiny adjacent room with a solitary candle flickering between them. The narrative, they claim, began not with words, but with a deep inhale, a long drawn-out breath. Then came the admission. "He did not come to be crowned, Father," Emilio whispered, "but to be remembered in silence." The archivist inquired who he was referring to. Emilio paused before answering. Instead, he produced a piece of folded fabric from his robes. It was a worn textile, pale and old, embroidered with a subtle sunburst design, an emblem absent from any standard Christian garment, yet well known to those who had explored the religious art of the Ethiopian tradition. The story followed immediately. Decades earlier, during a terrible drought, Emilio had journeyed to a secluded monastery carved into a cliff face high above the Blue Nile. The monks welcomed him warmly, even knowing he had come from Rome. There he witnessed a gathering after midnight, centred not on spoken sermons or scripture readings, but on chanting, a sound that was low, profound, nearly a hum. At the core stood an elderly monk who carried no holy book, but a vessel of radiance, literally a small bronze bowl holding a flame, completely shielded from air currents or heat. And as the communal singing grew, the elder spoke softly but firmly. He passed through fire, he left no ashes, he touched the rock, and it became bread. These phrases were not part of the canon, not from any gospel Emilio had ever encountered, but every monk bowed low in respect, some even shedding tears when asked for whom they sang. The reply was invariably the same, the one who travelled from the north. Back in Rome, when Emilio attempted to document his experience in a letter, it was intercepted. He was commanded never to mention it again, and so he waited for decades until the flicker of candlelight and the deep silence finally allowed the truth to emerge. It was an old monk from Lalibela who had the clearest recollection. His name was Father Simon, and despite being nearly blind, he could describe every colour on those walls with startling accuracy. What he remembered more clearly, however, was not the frescoes themselves, but the hymn he claimed they had once inspired. He said it was the final liturgy of St. Tekla Hymenot. Tekla Hymenot was not a man of many words. Legends suggest he spent 7 years praying while standing without rest, one leg withering from the extreme devotion. But it was what he murmured with his dying breath that drew the Vatican's gaze back toward Ethiopia before it was quickly diverted again. The words were written down not in Latin, but in Ge'ez on a single piece of parchment kept inside a bronze container beneath the church of Debri Libanos. The monk who discovered it in the year 1932 claimed the beeswax seal was still pliable. The Vatican dispatched representatives to study it. They returned with nothing definitive. The hymn was never sung in its entirety, not even once, but parts were translated, and one section in particular found its way into a restricted memo buried deep inside the Vatican's private records. From the stars of Galilee he travelled, not with a weapon, but with the tail, and in fire he taught, and in light he walked to the south where the fig trees listen. The phrase from the Stars of Galilee was annotated in the margin with an urgent scrawl, "Do not repeat." No further explanation given. There was another element, a peculiar musical notation unlike anything used in European sacred music. The distances between the notes were wider, more elastic, almost like marks for breathing. A few music scholars suggested it resembled ancient Jewish cantillation signs, but reversed, as if intended to be interpreted from the opposite side of something. Some suggest St. Tekla Hymenot's hymn resonated with more than just a tune. They claim it contained a deep memory that when spoken aloud, even in pieces, listeners experienced heat, like standing near a fireplace. One deacon reported hearing the sound of hooves in the distance while reciting the last verse. Another wept for an hour and could not explain why. The Vatican issued a quiet directive later that year. No further interaction with Debre Libanos concerning variations in liturgy. The bronze container was resealed. The monk who opened it became quiet and refused to give interviews for the rest of his existence. And the symbols, those mirrored notations, were boxed and stored in the Vatican Music Library under the designation non-liturgical fragments. They graces. But high in the mountains of Ethiopia, older monks still hum the melody late at night after prayers are done and the lamps are burning low. They insist it is not merely music. They say it is the sound of a man on his way home. It was an old monk from Lalibela who had the clearest recollection. His name was Father Saman, and despite being nearly blind, he could describe every colour on those walls with startling accuracy. What he remembered more clearly, however, was not the frescoes themselves, but the hymn he claimed they had once inspired. He said it was the final liturgy of St. Tekla Hymenot. Tekla Hymenot was not a man of many words. Legends suggest he spent 7 years praying while standing without rest, one leg withering from the extreme devotion. But it was what he murmured with his dying breath that drew the Vatican's gaze back toward Ethiopia before it was quickly diverted again. The words were written down not in Latin, but in Ge'ez on a single piece of parchment kept inside a bronze container beneath the church of Debre Libanos. The monk who discovered it in the year 1932 claimed the beeswax seal was still pliable. The Vatican dispatched representatives to study it. They returned with nothing definitive. The hymn was never sung in its entirety, not even once. But parts were translated, and one section in particular found its way into a restricted memo buried deep inside the Vatican's private records. From the Stars of Galilee he travelled, not with a weapon, but with the tail, and in fire he taught, and in light he walked to the south where the fig trees listen. The phrase from the Stars of Galilee was annotated in the margin with an urgent scrawl, "Do not repeat." No further explanation given. There was another element, a peculiar musical notation unlike anything used in European sacred music. The distances between the notes were wider, more elastic, almost like marks for breathing. A few music scholars suggested it resembled ancient Jewish cantillation signs, but reversed, as if intended to be interpreted from the opposite side of something. Some suggest St. Tekla Hymenot's hymn resonated with more than just a tune. They claim it contained a deep memory, that when spoken aloud, even in pieces, listeners experienced heat, like standing near a fireplace. One deacon reported hearing the sound of hooves in the distance while reciting the last verse. Another wept for an hour and could not explain why. The Vatican issued a quiet directive later that year. No further interaction with Debre Libanos concerning variations in liturgy. The bronze container was resealed. The monk who opened it became quiet and refused to give interviews for the rest of his existence, and the symbols, those mirrored notations, were boxed and stored in the Vatican Music Library under the designation non-liturgical fragments. They graces. But high in the mountains of Ethiopia, older monks still hum the melody late at night, after prayers are done and the lamps are burning low. They insist it is not merely music. They say it is the sound of a man on his way home. But there was something more, something not sung, not spoken, but captured, concealed beneath layers of silence and plaster. In a room not catalogued in the Vatican's public listings, a painting hangs behind a deep red velvet drape stitched closed with gold thread. Few have ever seen it. Even fewer have truly grasped its meaning. They refer to it as the stranger's blessing. The papal vault is not a typical room. Buried under feet of solid rock, it is more often discussed as a rumour than a certainty. A secret passed on from one pontiff to the next, protected not by alarms or locking mechanisms, but by the magnitude of its own secrecy. Those allowed entry do so under a vow, unspoken, binding, and everlasting. The painting was never officially listed. No artist's name, no date. But the painting technique suggests someone trained in the old Florentine styles, perhaps even earlier. The approach is careful, devout, yet the figure it portrays is anything but conventional. At first glance it looks like a classical icon, a figure in a robe standing beneath a fig tree with his arms gently elevated. Behind him a mountain, certainly Axum, and to his right a lion settled at his feet, not threatening, not regal, just present, observing. What unsettled those who viewed it was not the location, but the face. Not European, not exactly Ethiopian. It seemed to change depending on the viewer. A German academic once asserted the figure looked exactly like a man from his own town. An Argentine bishop saw a familiar family likeness, though he couldn't explain why. A nun reportedly fainted. There is a story that the painting was illegally brought into Rome during the late 19th century, at the time of one of the many Catholic missions to East Africa. Some speculate it was taken from a monastery wall in Gondar. Others suggest it was a present, a caution wrapped in artistry, meant for a single pope. But the most intriguing element is in the lower corner. Hidden beneath the edge of the man's garment is a mark, barely visible, etched in what seems to be charcoal. Yared. Not a family name, a name as ancient as the mountains themselves. St. Yared, the originator of Ethiopian liturgical music. A composer, not a painter. So why his name? One idea is that it is not a signature at all, but a message that Yared, through vision and rhythm, was attempting to convey something that music alone could not contain, that someone, somewhere, needed to witness it. In the year 1969, Pope Paul VI ordered the curtain permanently sewn shut. After gazing at the painting for 11 minutes, he is reported to have said, "This is not meant for us. Not yet." And still, behind the golden thread and the years, the figure waits, his hands raised, not in command but in offering, an offering the Vatican has chosen repeatedly to turn down. It was this moment of recall that sent a quiet shockwave through the halls of the Apostolic Palace in the early spring of 1987, a ripple that began with a murmur from a cardinal and culminated with a folded paper slip placed on the Pope's desk. A paper marked only with the words "Tes for Testimony." The Pope at that time, a man known for his great intellect and long periods of reflection, held the slip between his fingers without unfolding it. He knew the name not from official church teaching, nor from council, but from a moment buried deep in his own past. Before he wore the white vestments, before he was a bishop, he had once heard that name spoken by a seminary professor who had briefly lived among the Ethiopian monks. The teacher had called the Tesfa story a ghost in the official files, a whisper that had the power to overturn established institutions if ever shouted aloud. That night, after the Vatican's corridors had fallen silent and even the Swiss guards had directed their gaze to the night sky, the Pope entered his private office and opened a drawer sealed with wax. Inside were only 2 items: a photograph of an olive tree and a note written decades prior in his own handwriting. The note was concise, but every word was chosen carefully. "If he walked there too, then we must follow, not conceal." The Pope placed the old note next to the newly delivered slip, then picked up his pen. For several hours he wrote, stopping frequently, as if conversing with someone who wasn't physically present, but always attentive. His final thoughts, when reviewed today, are barely a paragraph long, but they contained something unusual in papal writing: doubt mixed with hope. "The Church fears splits," he wrote, "but it is cracks that allow the light to enter. If our Lord ventured farther than Rome has permitted, then our borders are not barriers but shadows waiting for the daylight." That final papal message was never released to the public. It was sealed in an envelope labelled ad limina and placed into the private archive beneath the Vatican library. Not even the Secretary of State was allowed to read it. Only the archivist, an old man who had long since stopped asking questions, handled the document. He filed it next to the folder marked "Test for Testimony" and made no record of it in the index. Years later, following that Pope's passing, his successor discovered the envelope during a private tour of the archives. He held it in his hands, recognised the script, and returned it to its drawer without reading a single word. Some suggest he worried about what it might undo. Others believe he already knew what it contained, but somewhere still in the layers of ink and silence, the final papal message waits. Not for approval, but for a time when acknowledging the past is no longer forbidden. And perhaps, had the truth been allowed to emerge sooner, a name murmured during the conclave of 1963 might have been heard a little clearer among the red-robed figures gathered beneath the frescoed ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. There was one cardinal whose presence mystified even the experienced observers of Vatican protocol. His name was Berhanu Yohannes. He was Ethiopian, educated in Rome, fluent in Latin and Ge'ez, and had once walked for 3 days through the Simeon Mountains just to deliver communion to a tiny village of 6 people. Most cardinals considered him a man of deep humility and learning, but for a few, especially those seated closest to the front, he represented a reality they were not prepared to confront. He was a living reminder of the Church's very first existence, when Christianity had no main centres, no marble walls, and no flags flying above its places of worship. Berhanu did not campaign for the role. He simply prayed. During the initial rounds of voting, he received only a handful of ballots, most likely cast by those who admired his peaceful nature rather than actually anticipating his election. But then something unexpected happened. A dozen votes, then 18, then 21. Murmurs began to spread through the chapel. Not panic, not yet, but shock. One French cardinal, known for his sharp political instincts, later privately confessed to a reporter that he believed for a brief moment the conclave might do something Rome was completely unprepared for, but it did not. The support faded. Berhanu's name vanished from the paper slips. By the 7th vote, a more predictable candidate had emerged. White smoke rose into the sky above St. Peter's Basilica. The event, however, was not entirely finished. That night, after the new pope had addressed the crowds in St. Peter's Square, Cardinal Berhanu returned to his small chamber in the Domus Sanctae Marthae. There, resting on his pillow, was an envelope with no seal. Inside, there was only one sentence written in careful script: "Your time will come, but not through our hands." To this day, no one knows who the sender was. The handwriting did not match any known Vatican official. The ink lacked a manufacturer's identification mark. The envelope disappeared the following morning. Berhanu Yohannes returned to Ethiopia shortly after. He never discussed the conclave again, but in a personal letter discovered after his passing, he wrote, "I never desired a throne. I only wished for the narrative to expand its reach, to extend to where footfalls had already trod long before Rome constructed its walls." Some speculate his name was written once more during the conclave of 1978, but again, only briefly. The possibility of an Ethiopian pope, it seems, was always either a little premature or perhaps too confronting for the atmosphere of silence Rome had grown to favour. That was the warning Father Ignacio recalled when he descended beneath the massive flagstones of St. Peter's Basilica on a quiet evening in 1967. He had been called, not by a letter, not by an audible voice, but by something much stranger, a faint whisper in the deepest part of his sleep, a dream of rhythmic footsteps echoing beneath the rock, of church walls that seemed to vibrate, and a voice, ancient and unmistakable, that spoke his name from below. Father Ignacio had always been a quiet man, perfectly content with translating forgotten ancient scrolls tucked away in the Vatican library. But that night a feeling stirred within him, something that felt older than mere curiosity. It was almost as if the secret itself had grown tired of waiting to be found. He slipped past the bronze doors near the chapel of the Pietà, moving by the light of a candle into a passage not found on any official map or tourist route. He had read of it once in the margin of a 15th century diary, a side tunnel used by papal undertakers during the Black Plague. It had since been permanently closed, or so everyone believed. What he discovered below was not simply a crypt. It was a vault lined with recessed spaces carved directly into the stone. Inside one niche there was no body, only a box the size of a shoebox, marked with the faint impression of a lion and a cross seal. He had encountered that exact symbol in his studies years before, traced on the edge of an Ethiopian manuscript that had disappeared before it could be properly catalogued. He reached for it, and then it happened. A sudden blast of cold air, but not his own exhalation. A single, breathy whisper. "You look, therefore you owe." He stumbled backward, his candle shaking violently. The whisper did not repeat, but then something else occurred. The box came open. Not completely, just a crack. Inside there was a cloth, black silk showing its age, wrapped around what appeared to be a piece of bone, human but incredibly smooth, as if worn down by the touch of countless hands over centuries. And carved along its surface were not Latin characters, but something older, Ge'ez. The bone was distinctly warm. Father Ignacio did not remember the return walk, but he woke the next morning in his study, the candle having burned out and dirt visible on his robes. He told no one of his experience. Years later, when the Vatican's crypts underwent refurbishment, that specific passage was sealed again, officially declared structurally unsafe. But the story did not fade away, because after that night, Father Ignacio started sketching. Strange geometric designs in the empty spaces of books, on maps, even on napkins, spiralling curves, lines that seemed to move when viewed for too long. When questioned about these drawings, he would only offer a slight smile and say that some things whisper back. And perhaps beneath the heavy stones that whisper remains, waiting still, not just to be heard, but to finally be answered. They assumed the passage had been permanently sealed. What lay beneath, however, was far more than a simple tomb. It was an underground chamber, its walls carved directly into the bedrock, forming a series of rock-cut niches. In one of those slots, there was no corpse, but a small box, the size of a man's shoe. It was marked with a faded stamp, a lion beneath a cross. He recognized the emblem instantly. He had tracked that very symbol years before, faintly drawn on the edge of an ancient Ethiopian text that vanished just prior to its archival registration. His hand moved toward the container, and then the atmosphere shifted, a cold current of air, not caused by his own breath, and a single, chilling utterance. "You witness, therefore you bear the cost." He lunged backward, the flame of his oil lamp wildly shaking. The voice did not return, but something else happened next. The container lid lifted, not completely, just a crack. Inside, he could see a swatch of fabric, black silk, fragile from the passing of centuries, wrapped around what seemed to be a section of bone. It was clearly human, yet strangely polished, as if handled by generations, and along its surface were not the expected Latin markings, but characters of an archaic script. Ge'ez. The fragment of bone was surprisingly warm. Father Ignacio had no recollection of leaving the space, waking only the next morning in his library, his lamp extinguished and his cassock covered in soil. He kept the discovery to himself. Years later, when the Vatican's subterranean areas were undergoing reconstruction, that entire section of the corridor was resealed, officially condemned as structurally unsound. But the story did not die, because from that night forward, Father Ignacio began sketching unusual figures in the margins of his texts, maps, and even casual notes. Curving patterns that pulled the eye inward, lines that appeared to shift when focused on too closely. When challenged, his only reply was a quiet smile and the phrase, "Some secrets reply to the listener." And perhaps deep beneath the stone foundations that faint voice still waits, not seeking to be perceived, but expecting a response. That statement lingered in the private study within the Apostolic Palace long after Father Thomas relayed it to the cardinal appointed to receive his information. It was never written down. It was never openly cited. It simply resonated, unbidden and unwelcome, within the minds of men whose lives were devoted to constructing truth from printed documents and official decrees, not from subterranean rock and ancient memory. 3 months after the encounter, in a small secondary room just beyond the primary vaults of the Vatican Library, a sealed portfolio was discreetly shelved. It carried no signet of the papacy, no individual name, and no public classification. However, inside was a typed pronouncement, concise, dry, and definitively conclusive. There is no evidence, either theological or historical, to support any claims regarding a journey made by Jesus of Nazareth to Ethiopia. No further investigation into this matter shall be undertaken. And that was the end of the matter, the final denial from the Holy See. The memo was silently distributed across the relevant departments, from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith to the Jesuit Commission for History. All existing field studies were immediately halted. Research funding was systematically withdrawn. The few academics who had expressed interest in the Ethiopian link were reassigned. Some were sent on unrelated assignments, others placed in inactive administrative posts. But calculated silence does not extinguish memory. It only dampens its sound. Beneath this official rejection, there were whispers of a final meeting held at the Domus Sancti Martha residence. 3 individuals, all high-ranking clergy, reportedly gathered under the pretense of discussing upcoming synod reforms. The actual content of their discussion is still unknown, but one of the participants, Archbishop Morandi, resigned inexplicably mere weeks later. Another took an early retirement. The third, Father Ludovico, was never heard from again. According to a maintenance worker who oversaw the rooms in the Domus, something was incinerated that evening. He recalled the distinctive scent. It was neither frankincense nor paper, but parchment, very old, extremely brittle, and completely gone by dawn. Why such an extreme response to a theory that was unverified, to a claim that lacked proof? That was the question no one dared to voice, and those who might have asked had already learned that certain doors within the Vatican are deliberately kept shut. And certain answers require the price of total professional isolation. But one man, an emeritus professor of ancient languages, still made visits to the archives on rare occasions. He always carried a modest wooden container, which held stone rubbings he'd made during a brief, unauthorized trip to Lalibela in 1987. Each time he arrived, the security staff would nod their heads, deliberately ignoring the small bulge beneath his coat, and each time he would settle in the most remote reading area, entirely alone, examining those cryptic curves and lines as if they might one day rearrange themselves. Because while the Vatican had issued its final word on the subject, not every question had been resolved and not every eyewitness had forgotten, and so he kept returning, week after week, his footsteps echoing softly through the Vatican Library's marble hallways like the quiet, consistent ticking of a forgotten clock. The emeritus professor, whose name had been erased from official records long ago, would occupy a far corner beneath a faded fresco of the Assumption, his gaze fixed on the tracings in his small wooden box. His hands, now aged and slightly shaking, followed the contours, much like someone trying to recall the face of a loved one who is gone. Outside, the Vatican operated with its typical measured efficiency. Cardinals convened in polished offices, tourists crowded St. Peter's Square, and the bells tolled their usual rhythm. Everything appeared correct, everything in its proper place. But true silence always fills the spaces that communication has abandoned. In the crypt beneath the great basilica, where the very passage of time felt slow, a single flame flickered before an unmarked cavity in the wall. It had not been ignited by a priest, nor was it part of any service. It simply burned night after night until it didn't. Then, without explanation, it would reappear. Rumours still circulated among a handful of the older monks, those who had studied before the Second Vatican Council, before contemporary attitudes settled over marble and sacred vestments. They spoke of an unnamed traveller, of a narrative suppressed not because it was blasphemous, but because it was disruptive, a narrative that did not challenge Christ's divine nature but significantly complicated his human experience. Because if he had journeyed the earth beyond the traditional confines of Bethlehem and Galilee, if he had stood beneath the carved entrances of Axum or shared a simple meal with the Cushite shepherds, what would that imply for the entire institution founded in his name? And that perhaps was the profound secret. Not a hidden scroll, not an ancient map, not a miracle kept under lock and key, but a question. A powerful, resonating question capable of shaking the foundations of every marble chamber in Rome. What if the Son of Man witnessed the world, and it was entirely different from the narrative we were given? The true goal was never to undermine faith, it was to broaden it. But expansion, when introduced to those whose duty is to protect the established knowledge, often appears as a threat, and so they closed the case. They sealed the passage, they burned the parchment, yet still far across the ocean and the deserts, in a sun-drenched monastery, where ancient chants are still sung in ge'ez and drums keep the beat of prayers older than any council, the original tale endures. It is sung softly at daybreak, when the morning haze settles like smoke around the rock-hewn crosses. The monks never mention Rome, they have no reason to. They simply remember. And within the deepest parts of the Vatican, even if no one has the courage to speak of it, the silence persists. Stay curious, and until next time, keep looking beneath the surface.